Folks, good evening. Hello, hello. How you doing? Welcome back. What it is?
What's happening?
What's happening? I hope you were all doing lovely this evening. Everybody alive and well out there in Zoom land? So, sure, why not? As much as you can be. It's Monday, isn't it? Right? It's feeling like a Monday for sure, right? It's very Monday-ish Monday. Let's call it that. And here we are Monday night doing the darn thing nonetheless. So it is what it is. Folks, I feel like I haven't seen you in like 10 billion years. I know it hasn't been that long, but I just had a lot going on over the past week. So good to see you all. Welcome back to another fun-filled evening of broker pre-licensing. This should be day 4 for you folks, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and now this next Monday is day 4. And we are just a rocking and a rolling and a boogieing on with all the real estate discussions. Folks, as per usual, I will open the floor to any questions, comments, concerns that you may have at this point in your endeavors to get your license in North Carolina. We can talk about them. Otherwise,
I got a question.
What you got, man?
I started late on the last course thing, so I'm like in the second chapter. So I just started late. Is it okay if I guess back on it? I just started late on it.
You talking about on the online program?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's explain that real quick, folks. Here's the thing. I am not going to police how fast or how slow you do that program. Here's the thing. You are all adults, and as such, you can hold yourself accountable on that. My concern is that you get it all done before the last day of class. Not the exam day, but the last day that we're actually doing education. Now, here's my one word of caution. While I'm not going to police it, please understand that it is almost impossible to catch up if you get too far behind, because it is a lot of material. So is it okay that you have not gotten to the program, the online program, the Broker Success Hub, to the same level that we've gotten in class? Yeah, it's okay. Just don't get behind, because it is very hard to catch up. Does that make sense? Yeah, good question. What else? Celicia, what you got?
So I don't have a question. It's more just a comment. So I've been trying to do some studying on my own, and I was kind of struggling with it. And so my husband had to actually remind me about your videos and stuff, and Sam. And like the videos were just so good that I forgot that I wasn't in an actual classroom setting. I caught myself trying to unmute so I could ask questions. And I felt so crazy.
That's awesome. So the ones on the HVW Real Estate School YouTube channel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which at this point, folks, like I said, I got all the way up through, and it's the exact same schedule as your class, and they are all the way up through day 11. So you're only on day 4. So you've got, ample amounts of material. And folks, I've been teaching this for a while, and so the way I teach it is pretty similar every single time. Sometimes I maybe even do a better job in some of the recordings. So it's there as a resource for you folks. I want you to have that as study material, because even if you are paying attention, there are times where you will miss things I say. It's just the way that this works. There's just so much information. So please don't forget that those are there. And you can always watch them or have them playing in the background when you're traveling to and from work, at night when you're cleaning or stuff. And when we get into things like the financing chapters, I highly recommend it, because just what we talk about in class for agency and financing is not going to be enough. And you need to hear it and rehear it and rehear it so it gets embedded in your brain. So I appreciate that, Celicia. I will be working on editing, the next 3 to 4 days and getting those up. And so you will have all 20 days of class available to you before we ever get to those days. So hopefully that's considered beneficial for you folks. And so, I just do that as extra stuff for study materials for y'all. It's just extra editing hours, but I'm willing to do it because I'm here for y'all to succeed. So hopefully those are useful for you.
Helps. It did. I'm agree with Celicia, because I had to leave class early on Wednesday because I wasn't feeling well, and I went back today and listened to the so it was, I think it said day 3 or 2. So I went back and listened to it, and I was like, oh, okay. Which I've read ahead already, but it just, makes sense once you read.
It helps, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
I'll tell you a funny story. There was, I'm actually teaching an in-person class at a physical office on Saturdays. And, one of my students in there is, very gung-ho, and he likes watching the videos to the extent that, I don't eliminate all of the, I'm sorry, I'll finish telling the story in a second. Y'all give me 1 second. This is one of my instructors. I just want to make sure everything's good with his class. Give me just 1 second. I apologize. I have an instructor who's teaching a post-licensing class tonight. Newer instructor, great guy, super energetic. And so I just want to make sure he was not having any chaotic things happening in his class that I needed to deal with, when I'm kind of doing classes at the same time. But here's a funny story. This one student in my weekend class, apparently he's been watching these videos so intently that just like I tell y'all kind of like funny stories about life like I am right now, they stay in the videos. And so he was actually like asking me something. I'm like, did I say that in this class? He's like, no, you didn't. I heard you say it in the video. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm happy to answer it for you nonetheless. And so if you watch the videos, there's a point where I talk about how I have a license in Colorado just because I wanted to take the Colorado licensing exam, just because it is considered one of the most difficult licensing exams in the nation. And so he asked me, he's like, do you maintain your Colorado license? I was like, no, I don't. How'd you know about this? So apparently you can learn very private things about my life that I share in these stories, and I don't remember telling y'all, that's not private. It was just funny that he catches it. Also, he gets real concerned because as you see in the videos, folks, you hear the students who took those classes, but I try not to put anybody on screen. Sometimes editing gets a little weird and, it occasionally happens in a brief blip. But, and so he's making commentaries like, oh, such and such is asking really great questions. I really appreciate them asking that. And then, they're like invested, right? They're like, well, did they pass? I'm like, yeah, they did. So it's like the real estate version of like your soap opera stories, right? I want to know, is Nick cheating on Jessica? I need to know this. What happened? Don't tell me, it's a spoiler. So yes, those are all there. You can easily find them just by going to YouTube and typing HPW Real Estate School, and it'll pop up. I, of course, have some under my name from like when I taught at other schools and I wasn't running this school, but I don't really advertise those because they're different branded materials and it's a different flow for the class, but they are still useful. So I appreciate that, Celicia. Folks, any other questions, comments, concerns that I can answer for y'all? Don't be shy. I am here to help.
I have a question.
Okay.
I've been going to GroupMe, and I can't see. I can see the chat, but I can't see the PDFs.
So I don't think I've uploaded any in there yet, but I will upload. Yeah, you will see them, Tyvolia, and please understand, you can always reach out. Send me an email like you did tonight until I get in class. I'm always happy to help. Anything you need, folks, if you send me an email and you say, hey, I'm struggling with this, I need help on this, do you have extra resources for this? I will try to do my darndest to get to you and help you any way I can. And so what I'll do is I'll take some time tomorrow morning because I'm not teaching a class, and I will upload all of your slides as PDFs into GroupMe, and then any supplemental materials that I think may be helpful. I've got some flashcards that an old student, a past student put together that I sometimes share. Now, they're not my materials. I've not vetted them. What I have read, they look great. And other students have been appreciative. But I got lots of resources that I will share in there. I just don't think there's any uploaded yet. But if you ever need anything, definitely email me, and I will make sure I help you out any way I can.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Anything else? If y'all don't have anything else, we gonna jump into some fun stuff where we left off. How's that sound? Now, folks, I teach about 10 billion classes a week, but if memory serves me correctly, I think your group left off with agricultural fixtures. Does that sound? Yeah, Cheyenne's giving me a nod. Constantine, yeah, that sounded cool. Folks, let's give you the quick little recap as I share my screen with you. Okay, that's right, Kirsten. Let's go. We started getting into some discussions on appurtenances. Folks, what is an appurtenance?
Something that runs with the land.
Something that runs with the land. Give me some examples of some appurtenances.
A house.
A house, yeah. An easement, yeah.
Yeah.
Air rights.
Water right.
Air rights, water rights, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Folks, y'all hit some good ones. Leases would be an appurtenance if there's a long-term lease that has to be transferred with it. Of course, covenants, conditions, restrictions, deed restrictions would be an appurtenance. And then even liens sometimes. We're going to get into that more in the financing section. So an appurtenance is anything that runs in the land, and that can be very encompassing, right? A lot of different things are considered an appurtenance. Well, let's differentiate between that other word that I used last week, which is an encumbrance. What is an encumbrance?
A limitation.
There you go. Some type of limitation on the ownership, okay? And so remember, some appurtenances are encumbrances and some encumbrances are appurtenant or appurtenances, but they're not the same word. And so let's give you an example. Subsurface rights are just an appurtenance, but having them is not an encumbrance, okay? Having them is having all of it, and so there's no limitation there, there's no negative there. So an encumbrance is some type of limitation. So an easement would be an encumbrance, okay? Covenants, conditions, restrictions, also known as deed restrictions, would be an encumbrance. We talked about the ability to put fences up or not, parking on the streets or not, and so those would be types of encumbrances. So an encumbrance, by definition, is just some type of limitation on the existence or use of the property. And we're going to talk more about those as we get deeper into this. So then we started talking about, the different appurtenances, as you said, the water rights, and we talked about the two broad categories of water rights. What were the broad categories?
Littoral and
Riparian.
There you go. Littoral and riparian. And remember, littoral is bodies of water with a tide. Typically your oceans, your bays, your sounds. Yeah. And then you had your riparian, which is basically everything else. Of course, there's some argument over lakes, but that should never really screw you up on the test. And so if we're dealing with, let's go and start with littoral. Where does the property ownership line go up to on littoral properties?
Water's edge.
up to the average tide, high tide.
There you go. Remember,
Something like that?
with littoral, those are bodies of waters with a tide. And so it goes up to the mean high tide mark, also known as the average high tide. Where the high tide typically sits is where the property ownership ends. But then when it's low tide, everything between that average high tide and low tide is considered public beach or public property. And so you can access that. Now there was a vocabulary word that came into play there. What is it called when we're talking about the land between the high tide and the low tide?
Foreshore.
Foreshore. Not like for sure, but foreshore. F-O-R-E, right? Foreshore. Okay, so that is littoral. And then we had riparian. Now, riparian we broke into two other subcategories. What do we break riparian into?
Navigable.
Non-navigable.
There you go. Beautiful. Navigable and non-navigable. Now, don't get so caught up on whether you can put a boat in there, because I have a pond and it can absolutely handle a John boat. Heck, if I wanted to, I could put a jet ski in there and go full-fledged Billy Madison, right? I could just be having a good old time. All right. But it's not navigable because it's not going anywhere. And so when we're dealing with navigable bodies of water under riparian rights, the ownership goes where now for navigable?
The edge of the water.
The edge of the water. That's exactly right. The example I gave you was tubing down the Neuse River. Folks, there are going to be houses on either side. If you get out of that water and you stand in there in somebody's backyard to use the bathroom, you're going to get two charges: trespassing and indecent exposure. Okay, that's their property. All right. Yeah, I'm sorry, Teray. I just got to keep you all awake. So that's their property. It only goes up to the water's edge. If it is non-navigable, where does your property ownership go?
To the center of the river.
There you go.
The land underneath.
There you go. Absolutely. The center. You own the land underneath the water, and as such, you own the water. And the example I gave you was my pond. It's my pond. I do own it. If somebody had a creek running through a property line, the way that they love to test this is that the property ownership goes halfway into that creek. Okay, that's your half of the creek, that's my half of the creek, and understand that neither of us can do anything to mess up each other's ownership. We can't dam it up, we can't damage it, we can't do any of that. But you do own the land and the water in these non-navigable. And then in the navigable, you only own up to the water's edge, not into the water. Now we talked about piers and docks, and that's that where you have to get special permitting to build in the public right-of-way. What you got, Alex?
Just can a really large river be in Littoral? Like it's just is next to your home and it's a really large river. Would that be or no?
In general, no, but here's what you have to understand. And so this is where I've kind of told you before. For the sake of this class, I've got to teach you the defaults. In reality, anything can happen because if a certain municipality wanted to designate that you could own into the river or that it considers to have a tide, you know, basically municipalities and government can change it depending on who has jurisdiction. But by default, a river falls under riparian and navigable. So typically, no. Of course, there's that kind of gray area where you go from the intercoastal into riverways, but you don't need to get that complex for the sake of this test. And you'll learn that if you ever do real estate in those regards. So we also talked about subsurface rights, okay, and the other vocabulary. When you sell off your subsurface rights, you still have to be given what's called the right of subjacent support, meaning you can wake up one morning and somebody can be mining for oil in your backyard, but they can't do it to the extent where it's going to destroy the structural integrity of your property. That was that right of subjacent support. The other thing we talked about is the right of lateral support that says your neighboring properties can't do anything that would destroy the structural integrity of your property. And then, of course, we got into another and probably the biggest discussion in regard to appurtenances, and that was fixtures. Folks, what is a fixture?
Personal property that has been attached to real property.
There you go.
Yeah.
I panicked for a second, right? You had me in the first half, not going to lie, Shia, but it's Shia? Shia. Yeah, there we go. Look at that. It's been a week and I still got it. I'm like, personal property. Ah! And then she finished it and I'm like, yeah. Personal property that has been attached to the real property and now is part of the real property. That's exactly right. The example, well, let me give you an example. If I drive to Home Depot and I buy a ceiling fan that's in the back of my truck, that is my personal property. It's a box with a ceiling fan. But when I bring it into my house and I attach it right here and replace this ceiling fan, it has now been affixed and as such becomes part of the real property. The reason why this discussion is so important, folks, is because when you're buying a house, you need to know what comes with it and what does not. And there are certain things that are obvious, right? We said last week, we know the Bugatti in the garage is not coming to you. We know that ain't your couch, okay? That ain't your clothes, that ain't your computer, that all leaves with the seller. And so if it's personal property, it defaults to leaving when the seller leaves. If it's real property, it defaults to staying for the new owner. And for the sake of this class, the biggest default is nailed, screwed, glued, or buried. It's probably a fixture. Okay, don't get so caught up on that. It's way different in the real world. As you saw, we have a list. Now, one of the other things that I told you is very testable is understanding, contractually speaking, when is the only time that we would need to mention personal property in a sales contract?
And it's like attached to the house.
If you wanted to come with the house.
If you want it to stay in the house, folks, because personal property defaults to leaving with the seller. The only time we would need to talk about it is if we wanted to do the opposite of what it's default to do. And folks, I have negotiated gun safes, I have negotiated couches, I've negotiated patio furniture, but we had to put it in the contract because it is not something that's supposed to stay. So conversely, when is the only time we need to talk about fixtures in the contract?
Other way around if you wanted to go.
If it's not going to stay, and remember those words, okay? Severance is the act of taking something that's a fixture, turning it back into personal property and leaving. It sounds so official, but it's a negotiation. If all parties agree that the seller can, disconnect their custom built shelves and they can take them with them, then sure, you can, if all parties agree. Okay, so the only time we talk about fixtures in a contract is if we want to do the opposite of the default, which is staying. And the only time we talk about personal property in the contract is if we want them to do the opposite of the default, which is leaving with the seller. Everybody good with that? So then we got to a couple special categories. And before we get back to what we're looking at right now, this agricultural fixture, there was one that I taught you just before the end of class last week. And that was a trade fixture. Folks, what was the other name for a trade fixture?
Chattel fixture.
Chattel fixture. And so tell me about this oxymoronic thing called a trade fixture or chattel fixture. What happens? What is it?
It's personal property that can be removed at the end of a lease. However, if you leave it, then it becomes property of the owner of the property.
Beautiful. Couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly what it is. When you're leasing commercial space and you buy your own prep tables, your kitchens, your walk-ins, your salon chairs, your bowling alley equipment, whatever it is, if you buy it and you attach it, yes, it's attached to the real estate, but because you are a commercial tenant, it remains your personal property that you can take with you when you vacate or at the end of your lease. And as Camilla said, if you abandon it, the owner will typically gain it by way of accession. If you abandon personal property in somebody else's house, yeah, it does become theirs eventually. But at the end of the lease, you can take it with you. Now, don't get so caught up on this. You just have to know this for the test. Of course, everything in real estate is negotiable. It is not uncommon for people to put the stuff in, but then leave it, and they got a reduced lease from their landlord because they made the property more valuable. Which I said is also true of where we left off. In North Carolina, we have this special thing called an agricultural fixture, where if a tenant farmer, somebody who does not own the property, installs anything permanently like a grain silo, water troughs, fences, barns, or anything, it automatically becomes the real property of the property owner, even though it was installed by a tenant. Now, nobody get so offended for this fictitious tenant farmer. Okay, you just have to understand that's the default. If the question on the test says, Farmer Steve is renting land from Bob and installs a grain silo in North Carolina, what is the best way to look at this grain silo? The answer is going to be real property of the property owner. Okay, that's all you have to deal with. But in the real world, could we negotiate that the tenant could take it down? Sure, we could. Could we negotiate that the rent was reduced or free for months because they made the property more valuable? Sure, we could. Everything in real estate is negotiable, but what you're going to be tested on and what you're going to have to understand is the defaults and what it would take to do the opposite of the default. Is everybody with me? What you got, Alex?
This is like kind of off topic, but it's about that if a tenant does put one of those in, let's say, I said at least, but he takes it off and still brings it back without you knowing, is that illegal, or is there any legal way you could move forward with that?
Don't worry about it.
Right.
Focus on the test. Yep, too complex. Attorney, right? So
CYA.
yeah, right. There you go. Cover your tuchus. Also, contact your attorney. Those are the two things that you need to know. Let's talk about another special category, folks. Have you people in here ever heard of companies or businesses like Rent-A-Center or Aaron's? You ever heard of them places? Sure you have. I just like to use them as an example, not because it's especially common for this to happen in real estate, but to help you understand the next thing. This next thing is what we call the UCC, okay? The North Carolina Uniform Commercial Code, UCC. And so what this basically states is there are certain things that would normally be considered real property, but if they have a security agreement attached to them because you owe money on them, they remain personal property nonetheless that can be taken out of the property. And so in North Carolina, as an example, a dishwasher is considered real property. If you got that dishwasher from Aaron's or Rent-A-Center and they had a security agreement against it, and then you sold that house, never disclosed it, well, that's an issue in and of itself, and you stop paying on it, Aaron's or Rent-A-Center can still come knock at the door even though there's a new person owning it and remove that dishwasher. It remains personal property if there's this credit agreement or security agreement attached to it. Let me give you another common example of these. HVAC units. They're very expensive, sometimes $7,000 or $8,000, and so some people will finance them. Well, number one, the company who installs them will very often attach what's called a mechanics lien. But that aside, they will at least maintain a security agreement against them to say if you don't pay them, they can take it out, even though an HVAC unit is normally considered real property. So that is the Uniform Commercial Code. Once again, not a very common happenstance in real estate, but could it arise? Sure. And this is why we like to have detailed conversations about anything that's leased and or not owned in a transaction, so we don't have those surprises where you buy a house and somebody knocks on your door to remove your dishwasher. That'd be a bad day. So let's keep going with these discussions, okay? I've already used the word improvement multiple times. And so an improvement is, of course, anything that increases the value of a piece of land. And so we said houses are considered improvements. Sidewalks could be considered improvements. Roads, water lines, infrastructure, all these things are considered improvements because we can all agree raw dirt is not as valuable as dirt that is ready to be built on because it's got water and electric and sewer and all these different things. Now, in that regard, there is this technical differentiation of what we call improvements on the land versus improvements to the land. Okay. Improvements on the land are your private in nature, your houses, your fences, your, for your personal use. Improvements to the land are the infrastructure ones, putting sidewalks, putting public right-of-way road access, utility lines, sewer hookups, all these different things are improvements to the land. Also, if you want to get technical, when you utilize an improvement on the land, it's no longer just called land, it's now called real estate or real property when we include that bundle of legal rights. And as we said, if we're talking about improvements, improvements are a type of appurtenance because anything you do to the land typically does get conveyed to the next property owner. So they are appurtenances. Everybody still okay out there? I don't see any tears. It's always a good sign. Not yet. We'll get there though. So let's talk about a more unique differentiation between personal and real property. Okay, folks, what is a manufactured home?
It's a home that's built in a factory, and isn't it registered with the DMV instead of
in a mobile home? Mm-hmm.
There you go, folks. When I say manufactured home, manufactured mobile trailer, those are all the same thing. Okay, manufactured.
What?
Yeah, hang tight, Trey. Hang tight. Hang tight. Yeah, listen, hold up now. We're going to get there. Okay, hold on. All right, that's what I'm here for. So, when you're dealing with a manufactured home, folks, understand that manufactured, mobile, and trailer are all the same thing. However, unbeknownst to a lot of people, modular is something else completely, okay? Manufactured and modular are not the same. They are not the same. They are not the same. So, let's start with manufactured, okay? Manufactured homes, also called trailers, also called mobile homes, as Camilla just said, are built in a factory, and they are built on a steel chassis. And they have wheels and axles and a tow hitch. That is why they're called mobile. They can be attached to a truck and pulled behind it in theory. Now, most trucks aren't big enough, but that's what they're called. They're called mobile homes. And as such, folks, they actually have a title, the actual physical title, just like your car does. And they are registered with the DMV, which makes them a piece of personal property, just like your automobile vehicle. You pay personal property taxes on a mobile home. So mobile homes are personal property. If you wanted to buy a mobile home off of a mobile home lot, you're getting a personal loan. However, there is a process that can occur that can convert this mobile home, which starts off as personal property, into real property. It is a very specific process, okay? Here's what has to happen. You have to install the mobile home on a permanent foundation on land that you also own. You have to remove the wheels, the axles, and the hitch. And you have to file what's called an affidavit of conversion with the DMV, basically canceling the title, letting them know that you are no longer treating it as personal property, and as such will not be paying personal property taxes on it, that you are now treating it as real property. If all of those criteria are met, it has now been converted to real property. Now, let me point out something, folks, as to why this is kind of an important discussion to have from a real estate point of view. All right. I told you last week that a refrigerator in North Carolina is what?
Personal property.
So,
There you go. In North Carolina, a refrigerator is considered personal property. So, imagine that you were putting an offer in on behalf of a buyer client as a real estate broker. You need, if they want the refrigerator, you need to ask for it in the contract. You agree? Okay. Well, let's say you have an oopsie and you don't ask for it in the contract. Folks, when you get there on the day of closing, is that refrigerator going to be there?
Probably not.
Probably not. Because if you didn't ask, the seller's probably just going to take it with them or do whatever to it, okay? And imagine that as a real estate broker, that's a bad day, because guess what you about to do, folks? You about to buy a real expensive closing gift. It's called a refrigerator because you done messed up, Ron. Now, as bad as that is, let me change the scenario. Imagine putting in an offer on behalf of a buyer for a piece of land that also has a mobile home on it, and it's not been converted to real property, and you don't ask for the mobile home, and you get there on the day of closing and the house is gone. You ain't going to be able to buy that as a closing gift, Slick. I don't care how dilapidated it was. You aren't making enough money to buy them a new manufactured home. You think this might be important to understand? That's right. That's a Hot Mess Express, folks. So understand that a manufactured home starts off as personal property. But as I said, can be converted to real property if, as mentioned, you remove the wheels, the axles, the hitch, put it on a permanent foundation on land that you also own, and file that affidavit of conversion with the Department of Motor Vehicles. At that point, it is all considered part of the real estate or real property. And when you put an offer in, it's all included. Now, in the real world, folks, even if it's been converted, we still specifically name the manufactured home in the transaction, just because we never want any issues. But understand that it does start as personal property. Now, I'll tell you one other interesting thing about this. Here in a little bit, we're going to talk about public and private land use controls. And one of the discussions in the public and private land use control section is about building codes. Building codes, folks, are minimum construction standards of safety. Because these are built in a factory and then carted off somewhere, they are an exemption to local building codes. They only have to meet what we call HUD standards. Okay? HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Minimum construction standards. Now, this is why they tell you if a hurricane or a tornado is coming through, you don't want to be in a manufactured home. They are not built typically as sturdy as local site-built or stick-built homes, as we call them, because they just have to meet these minimum construction standards. So there's a little note about that right here.
I have a question about this.
For sure.
So when I was looking at it, when you convert it to like an actual real property, do they change? Like, do you have to do like a whole like code for it, or does it just it is what it is?
It is what it is.
Okay.
It is just basically all we're saying is that you're no longer paying personal property taxes on it, and that, you know, if you're selling that piece of real estate, it's part of it. That's the only thing that converting it actually technically does. It is still a manufactured home. It still doesn't have quite the same value as a site-built or stick-built home. It is still only built to those minimum HUD standards. You know, nothing changes really, except the way that we kind of look at it for tax purposes. That's what it technically happens for. Yeah.
Thank you.
For sure. What you got, Mike?
Little off topic. Are eviction processes different for trailers than they are for actual?
No.
It's registered as a car, like.
Well,
Would you,
most of them.
another day.
So here's the thing.
Does it get repoed?
Well, and that's the thing. If you're not paying your money on it, it does get repoed just like a car does. But if you own it and you are renting it out, all residential tenant laws still are in place, right? The Residential Rental Agreements Act, meaning it has to meet certain standards. The long-term leases, the acts prohibiting retaliatory evictions, all of those eviction processes for tenants renting one would be the same. Nothing would change there. You can't just like circumvent it, like, I don't have to follow any laws. This is technically a car. Come after me, copper. It doesn't quite work like that, right? But it's the same. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a bad day. You ever see those online videos, right, where like people are going and repoing sheds? That's bad enough. People get their cars repoed, they get their sheds repoed. But I've seen it too, as Cheyenne said, you don't pay it, they're going to come repo your whole house. It's a bad day to like not pay your note on your car and it's gone. It's a whole bad thing, another bad thing for your house to just be gone. So probably should make sure you
Just
pay
like
that.
that show, Lizard Like Telling.
That's exactly right. You know, it's just gone. Okay, nothing you can do about it. It's not fun. So we've been talking about manufactured, also called mobile, also called trailer. Okay, now let's switch gears. Okay, get your minds right, because they sound similar, but not the same thing is what we call a modular home. A modular is also built in a factory. However, it is built in sections. Think of it like the Real House version of Legos. They basically build big chunks of the house in smaller sections in this warehouse, cart them off on the back of a truck, and then attach them to a permanent foundation. These are never considered personal property. They're considered pieces that as soon as they are put on that permanent foundation, they're considered real property, okay? So big differentiation in that regard. They are automatically real property as soon as they're put on the foundation. The other thing is they do have to meet the same state and local building codes as a site-built or stick-built home. So even though they're built in a factory, they have to, let's say, if you were installing one in Wake County, it would have to be built to the exact same standards as any house that was built in Wake County. And we'll talk a little bit more about the building codes down the road. But that's a big difference from manufactured, okay? Has to be built to those same building codes as site-built or stick-built, and it is considered real property as soon as it's put on the foundation. So let me warn you about what we're about. That sounds silly. What we're about to get into. Okay, and there's a little word of caution here, folks. This next section is the first crap. I don't like this section, for lack of a better word. Okay, this is the first real thing that I'm going to start teaching, and you're gonna be like, I don't like it. Okay, you're gonna throw up in your mouth a little bit. Now here's I'm gonna say it though. It is absolutely testable. But is there a lot of questions in regard to these things? No. Do not let these things hurt your feelings, okay? I'm going to tell you why you're not going to like them. Everything that I'm about to teach you in this next little section is stuff that you've probably never heard before in your life. And I always have to warn students of something, okay? You automatically don't like if it doesn't make sense to you. But here's the thing. Just because it doesn't make sense to you doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. And once you realize that, you have an easier time grasping these concepts. The other thing to realize is the more and more that you hear them, the more and more you'll get comfortable with them, okay? I just wanted to mentally prepare you because I've taught this class way too many times, and I automatically can see the disgust as I start teaching this next section, right? Everybody goes from like eagerly talking about fixtures, and I start saying this stuff, and you're like, right, you just look like somebody farted in a crowded elevator. You don't like it, okay? You're just not happy about it, but we're gonna get through this, okay? So let's start with an easy concept. Folks, we got to talk about the word estate. You've heard this word before, okay? Estates. Estate sale, real estate as the class implies, okay? Estates. Now for the sake of this class, estate means what level of interest do you have in a property? And I don't mean like, dang girl, that's a thick property, I'd like to buy it a drink. Okay, that's not what we're talking about when we say interest, okay? What type of relationship do you have in a property? Can we all agree that if you own a home, you have that type of relationship with a property? You got a relationship to that real estate, right? Can we all agree that if you're currently renting a home, you have a relationship to it? And so that's all we're talking about here when we say estates. What type of relationship do you have to this piece of property? What kind of interest do you have in this property? And so, of course, as I just clarified, you have a relationship whether you own it or whether you rent it. But we can all agree those are different types of relationships. So there's the first categorization for estates. We break estates into what we call freehold estates, which are estates of ownership, and what we call non-freehold, or also referred to as leasehold estates, which are estates not of ownership. Okay, so freehold estates are estates of ownership. You own something. Non-freehold are estates of lease. You're leasing something. You don't own it. Everybody okay with that statement? So let me tell you how we're going to tackle this, folks. I find that because of the complexities and intricacies of this section, that if I start putting up all the slides, you'll be so focused, some of you will be so focused on the slides that you're not actually listening to my words. And if you miss my words and only focus on the slides, you may not grasp it as much. So I'm going to put a chart up, and it's going to be very intimidating to start with. And we're just going to work our way down this chart piece by piece. That'll be your introduction to this section. And then I will give you slides that also solidify the material. Is everybody okay with that? So I know some of you like to see it on paper. You will. I just like to take some time to explain it first. So if you are looking at this estates chart here, well, I told you we've got freehold, which are estates of ownership, and then we got leasehold, also called non-freehold, which are estates of lease. We'll talk more about the leasehold in a little bit and in a later section. So I want us to focus on the freehold estates right now, okay? Just say it back to me. Freehold are estates of what?
Ownership.
Ownership. Thank you. So if you look at this chart, folks, there are a lot of items under there. Understand that every single thing under that freehold section is some type of ownership. That's very important. Okay, it is. It's ownership. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a freehold estate. Does that statement make sense for you?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, please understand that some of it is weird ownership that you've never heard of, that doesn't make sense to you. But once again, I will reiterate, just because it doesn't make sense to you doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. So let's start on the more straightforward side, folks. Let's start with the fee simple side, okay? Fee simple is what we would call permanent, okay? Anything under that fee simple side, we have not put any time frames on it. Let me ask you a question. If you own your house right now, how long will you own it for?
As long as I'm here.
As long as you want to, right? Can we agree that there is nobody forcing you to sell it if you've got it paid off, let's say? There's nobody forcing you to sell it at any time. You agree?
Yes.
That's all fee simple means, okay? It means there is nobody restricting the amount of time that you can own it. Now, we said in earlier classes, can you do whatever you want with your property? Could you tear it down and build a strip club?
No.
Why not?
Limited to covenants or
Zoning restrictions.
There you go.
zonings.
Nailed it. Now, folks, I want you to understand, because students have a tendency to get confused with this. When you own your home, you typically do own your home fee simple absolute. And as you look right here, fee simple absolute means no restrictions. Well, that's not entirely true, because you still have restrictive covenants and potentially public land use controls. So don't get confused when I say no restrictions. I mean no restrictions that could hurt your ownership. Okay, that's what I mean. That's all fee simple absolute means. Most people own their houses fee simple absolute. Means nobody is restricting how long you can own it, and nobody is restricting what you can do with that property, at least not to the extent that could ever hurt your ownership. You okay with that statement?
Yes.
Okay. And let me give you an example. Folks, if you live in an area with restrictive covenants that say you can't have chickens, what happens if you have chickens?
You get
Fine.
fine. Yes.
There you go. You're going to get a fine, and somebody's going to tell you to stop. Are you going to lose your house over it?
No.
Do you see the point here? When I say no restrictions, the restrictions may exist, but they're not strong enough to hurt your ownership. Now, let me explain why that point is so important here. In this other side, fee simple, defeasible. Well, what does that word defeasible sound like to you? What kind of root word can you think of that sounds like that?
Defeat.
Defeat. Defeated. So folks, fee simple defeasible is a type of ownership that has restrictions so powerful that if you don't follow the rules, you can defeat your own ownership. That is fee simple defeasible. Okay? Now I'm going to tell you there's another name for this, folks. You've got to know this other name. It is very testable. The other name is qualified fee. And just like defeat, right? You can defeat your own ownership, or in other words, you have to qualify for your ownership. We are limiting your use of the property to such a powerful extent that if you don't follow the rules, you don't own it anymore. Which seems crazy, but that's a thing. Everybody still okay? Now,
You say that one more time?
yeah. Fee simple defeasible, also called qualified fee, is limiting your use in such a powerful way that if you don't follow the rules, you don't own the property anymore. It's no longer yours. Now, there's no time period on it because we already said fee simple has no time period. So the broad category, there's nothing restricting the time that you can own this. But on that side with the fee simple defeasible, also called qualified fee, your use is restricted in such a powerful way that if you don't follow the rules, you could lose your ownership. What you got, Alex?
That's by the state, right?
No.
Or is that a county?
This is individual property owners setting this restriction.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, individual property owners.
Wait, so like the last person that sold you the house?
Any person in the lineage of selling that house. These are pertinences. They run forever.
Okay.
Yep.
And you said defeasible, fee simple defeasible was also known as qualified.
Qualified fee. Yep, absolutely. And you could see both on the test interchangeably. Absolutely. What you got, Bo?
So if my father bought a neighborhood need 55 plus people can live in that neighborhood, and then he transferred that title to me, and then that neighborhood need 55 plus age to live in. So that means we cannot to inherit that stuff.
So Bo's question is, if my dad bought a house in a 55 and up community and he left it to me and it's still a 55 and up community, does that mean I can't inherit it? We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the fair housing section. But here's the short answer, Bo. That is restricting occupancy, not ownership. So let's say that you are not 55, Bo. You can still own the house. You just can't live there. Now, that is a set of restrictive covenants, not necessarily a fee simple defeasible. And so there are rules that they are enforcing, could potentially fine you and take you to court over. So not quite the same category here. But we will talk about that a little bit more down the road.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just provide another piece of clarity, folks. When you're looking at your test, okay, these two will mean the same thing on the test, even though fee simple is the broad category. If you see it say something like Seth owns a property fee simple, you can read that as fee simple absolute, okay? So when we say fee simple absolute, that is the highest and best form of ownership. We are not restricting the time that you own it, and we're not restricting to the use of the property, at least not to the extent that you could ever lose your ownership. And then when we go to this other side, fee simple defeasible is also called qualified fee. Now that is, once again, a broad category. It's just a type of ownership where we have not limited the time you will own it, but we have put rules so powerful that if you don't follow them, you could lose your ownership. Now, as you can see on this chart, there are two subcategories of fee simple defeasible, also called qualified fee. Let's start with the one on the left. It is fee simple determinable. And here's what it says. We have determined the one allowable use of the property. It has been determined what you can do with this property. So let me give you an example. McKinney I'm going to give you ownership of a horse farm so long as you only ever use it as a horse farm. What is McKinney allowed to use that property for?
Only as a horse farm.
Only as a horse farm. Now let me explain this to you. If I give ownership to McKinney, she does own it. How long will McKinney own that horse farm for?
Forever.
As long as she wants. But here's what happens. McKinney wakes up one day and says, nope, I'm turning this into a restaurant. The second that she stops using it as a horse farm, she doesn't own it anymore. It does what's called reverts back to the grantor. I'm the grantor because I gave it to her. It is automatically my property again. That's how powerful these are. These rules are so powerful that you can defeat your ownership. She was the owner and could have been forever. But because she didn't follow this very specific rule, I said you can only use it as a horse farm. The second she does that, it automatically reverts back to me, and now I'm the owner again. What you got, Kirsten?
Sure, I understand this because this was definitely an area I struggled last time. So if she purchased it, the same thing, it goes back to the original owner, even though she purchased it.
Correct.
Not if it's gifted, it's in any circumstance.
Any circumstances. This could be gifted, it could be sold, it could be willed, it does not matter. And now, folks, this would be outlined on the deed. It would say that, right? It would say that Seth Chauncey, grantor, is giving this property, and it would give a legal description of it to McKinney. Is it Furland? Is that how you say it? Okay. And it would say, fee simple defeasible, so long as McKinney only ever utilizes this property as a equestrian farm or whatever legal language we wanted to put in there. It would say it on her deeded ownership where a title was transferred by way of that deed. It's spelled out. Doesn't matter how she acquired it. It's on there.
Does she lose the money?
Yeah, arguably. She would lose the money because she paid for it in that conditional right. And if she knew that, right? She knew it. And so she would lose it potentially. What you got, McKinney?
Okay, so this might be a dumb question or redundant, but I just want to make sure. If I have the horses, what if I have another like animal on the farm too? Does that also revoke all of my rights?
Adult diapers.
Okay.
It depends on the language, right? I mean, you know, just to give it as an example, if I said horses, only horses and nothing but horses, and you get a pig, you're screwed. If I say horse farm or similar livestock farm, you're fine. It's whatever language we put in there. Now, folks, I just always use the horse farm as an example because it's just easy. But I mean, it could state anything. It's just an agreement between the parties in whatever we decide, right? What you got, Constantine?
This might also be a dumb question, but when you say you're the grantor and you're granting someone this property, are you quite literally like just handing them the ownership, or are you like selling it to them?
It doesn't matter. It could be any. Grantor means I was the old owner, she's a new owner. Remember, grantor, grantee are the parties on a deed. And we're going to talk more about deeds today. And so the person who's giving, remember those or words? The or is the give or the e is the receivee. So as the old owner, I'm named as the grantor. As the new owner, she's named as the grantee. The deed is just going to show that. It's not necessarily going to show whether I gifted it to her, whether I willed it to her, whether I sold it to her. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, I'm still the grantor. She's still the grantee. Yeah. And I'm going to give you a lot of examples. Now, there's a really good question in chat before I get to your question, Journey. The question in chat was, so is the land inheritable for the family as long as they keep it in a horse farm? Yes. Folks, yes. So McKinney owns this horse farm. When McKinney dies, she can leave it to her daughter. Now, what is her daughter allowed to do with that piece of property? Horse farm. Because this is an appurtenance. It doesn't change. Whatever you have is all that you can give. McKinney can only give it to anybody else. Folks, let me ask you the question. Could McKinney sell this property?
Yes.
Yes, and the new buyer would have to use it as what? Horse farm. There you go. What you got, Durani?
So let's say I I guess like you sold it to the person but has to be a horse farm only. What if they don't keep it as a horse farm, but the person who it used to belong to is no longer with us? Who would it go to if it's not a horse farm anymore?
Here's what happens, okay? When we're dealing with fee simple determinable, if you stop following the rules, it goes back to the grantor. If the grantor is dead, it goes to the grantor's heirs. So let's say that I'm dead and gone and McKinney's daughter stops using it as a horse farm. It goes back to my kids. You cannot circumvent this unless you've got billions of dollars. I'll give you an example of that in a second.
What if they don't have
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, and don't get, folks, once again, focus on the test, okay? Like, I know these are very interesting concepts, and you all want to know, if this, then that, if this, then that. We can't go down these rabbit holes because it's just going to confuse you more than anything. You got to focus from a testable point of view, right? This is not, stump me with legal aspects. This is why we have attorneys that make the big bucks. They would have to hash it out, right? What you got? Shia?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. It's so, yeah.
Don't question yourself. You got it.
Okay. All right.
So it's enforced. So this is enforced by who again? I'm sorry, I missed that part.
This is enforced by private property owners. And so this would be, let me just go down. I'll go down a miniature rabbit hole. Okay. Let's say that in my example, McKinney's daughter has owned it for 10 years. And in those 10 years that she's owned it, she hasn't been using it as a horse farm. Well, the only person who could really enforce it and or care are my heirs and assigns. But if my son is going through my old documents and my, safe, and he sees that I gifted this property or transferred it to McKinney, and he's curious and he looks it up and he sees that it's no longer being used as a horse farm by her, he could go to court and he could regain access just like that. So this is where, you can roll the dice and not follow the rules, but because it's written in such a way, you can and will lose your ownership. Now, the way that you should test this determinable, though, it automatically reverts. Even though nobody knows it, legally speaking, the second you stop doing it, it is said to no longer be yours. Even though nobody has enforced it yet, that's just the way that the verbiage goes. It is no longer yours. It automatically reverts to the grantor and the grantor's heirs. But the government's not getting involved in this. Of course, Judge Judy would if we were hashing it out over legal ownership, but this is between private property owners. Yeah. Somebody else had a question. I'm sorry, Cheyenne, was it you? It was you.
I was kind of answering because I was wondering who determines if it's a fee simple, but pretty much answered my question. It's the private property owner.
Yeah, it's private property owner. I'll give you a real world example of this, folks. I had a student in the class one time. It was like, well, Seth, could I put a restriction on my property that says that it can never be developed into a neighborhood and it stays natural and not commercialized? I said, of course you can. You're the owner. Now, have you hurt the value of your property immensely? Sure. Folks, let me tell you why this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. You ready for this? It's because you're not a philanthropic billionaire. That's the reason this doesn't make sense to you. Let's give you a real world example of this. There are rich people who, when they pass, will leave giant pieces of property to NC State, to Chapel Hill, to the North Carolina Zoological Park, to a foundation. And they will put conditions that say, I'm leaving this to this institution so long as they only ever use it as a blank. Last time I checked, none of you are philanthropic billionaires, which is why it may be a little bit of an abstract concept.
Okay.
It happens all the time. It's just not normal for us who barely buy one property in our lives, most of us, and then that's the only thing we got to worry about, and we're probably not really worried about it after we sell it or anything like that. Now, I'm going to tie this into a real-world scenario in just a moment, but I want to explain the other one first before I give you a real-world scenario that will hopefully make sense to you. What you got, Jamila?
I just had a question. So, what document would this be in?
The deed.
Okay.
And we're going to talk more about deeds. The deed is the document that shows the transfer of title from one party to another party. And so it would be outlined right there in the deed where it would be recorded in the public record for all to see.
Okay.
Also, your camera's off. There you go.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened.
No worries. So let's talk about the other one, okay? Fee simple determinable is we've determined the one use. This is the only thing that you are allowed to use it for. And if you stop, you automatically lose your property. Okay, it's what we call automatic reversion. And we're going to talk about that. Fee simple subject to a condition, also called fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. Folks, it is a mouthful. Okay, whoever came up with a name for that should be slapped, but it is what it is. Fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. This one's a little bit different. This one says, do whatever you want as long as you don't do this one thing. See the difference? Determinable, it says, this is the only thing you can do. Fee simple subject to a condition subsequent says, do anything except this. And so it could be something like, you can use it for whatever you want as long as you never sell alcohol on the property. You can have a restaurant, you can have a farm, you can have a house, you can have whatever you want as long as you don't sell alcohol. A big difference there. Now, one other differentiation between the two is if you ever break that one rule, this one is not said to automatically revert back to the grantor or the grantor's heirs. You would actually have to go through a court proceeding to get ownership back. Arguably, it's probably so that they can remedy the situation. So if I give Constantine a property and says, do whatever you want as long as you don't sell alcohol. He says, screw that, I'm opening the hottest bar you have ever seen, my man. And he starts selling alcohol and I take him to court and he gets his summons. He'd be like, I'm just kidding, I stopped. No, it's fine, I stopped. Ain't no alcohol, okay? It's a religious bar. We serve coffee, okay, but it's like low-grade caffeine. It's not even the high-grade stuff, okay? Right? He could change it. Presumably that's kind of the intention, is they could fix it because it's that one thing they weren't supposed to do. So you would have to regain ownership by way of a court proceeding, but if they don't stop, you can get ownership back. How are we feeling? What you got, Constantine?
Can you limit to more than one thing? Like, for example, like you said, as long as I don't sell alcohol, say, but don't do this either, or don't do that either.
Absolutely.
Is there a vocabulary word for that?
No, it's still just fee simple subject to condition subsequent, just with multiple conditions.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And then same thing. I mean, fee simple determinable, as I said, you could piggyback as long as you only ever use it as a horse, pig, chicken farm. I mean, it's just basically the general verbiage for what you have to do or what you can't do. And in such a powerful light that you could lose your ownership, right? Because as I said, not just restrictive covenants, because restrictive covenants aren't powerful enough that you're going to lose your ownership. But there are still rules, under zoning and under restrictive covenants, but not that powerful. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you.
I've also seen them use stuff like this to cover stuff up as well.
In what regard?
I used to own a couple gas stations in New York, and they would put in like crazy stuff like you can't use this as a gas station as long as George Bush's heirs are alive. But it was because there was like an environmental issue under it.
Oh yeah.
So they didn't want you to dig under it.
Well, yeah. So maybe if you're a serial killer, right? You can't dig in the backyard so long as you own this property, okay? Don't say, because then you're going to find my dead bodies, right? I suppose you could get creative for all kinds of reasons, right? Maybe Dahmer should have done this. I don't know. Now, folks, I'm going to tie this into a real world scenario to hopefully make it stick, but I'll go ahead and let you take your break, okay? It's 7:12, but I'll give you a couple extra minutes as I tend to do. Come back at 7:25. And I'll give you a real world example and then we'll move into the other thing. So I'm back at 7:25. Whoop, whoop. So, folks, let me give you a real world example, okay, of fee simple determinable. And then I'll tell you kind of a funny story. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit because it was kind of a very odd thing, but it'll help you understand this point. Have you ever heard of Dorothea Dix in Raleigh? Some of you know, some of you yes. Let me give you a little, some yeses. Let me give you a little story here. Dorothea Dix is now a park, okay? But historically, Dorothea Dix was a mental health hospital. And it was actually land that was donated to the city of Raleigh by the Dix family, D-I-X, okay, Dix. And they donated it to the city of Raleigh, fee simple determinable. And what they said is the city of Raleigh will own this so long as they only ever use this as a mental health institution. And it was that for a while, and arguably it was not a great one, okay, but it was one. And as you know, values of land and the triangle, Raleigh included, have gone up astronomically in the past 20 years. And this Dix land is no exception. And so, folks, imagine, will you, some council members of the city of Raleigh taking a look at that, and they said, it's a daggum shame that we have to maintain this property as a mental health institution, and it's not even a good one at that. That land is worth billions now, and we're not allowed to do anything else with it. And somebody else is like, yep. That would be a problem because since we own it fee simple determinable, so long as we only ever use it as a mental health institution, if we were to change our use, it would go back to the Dix family or their heirs or assigns. And they said, yep, that's unfortunate. And then somebody in the room says, there is no Dix family. And then they're like, well, what you mean? And they said, well, they're all dead. And I said, all of them? And I said, yeah, we're Dixless. Ain't no Dix. Okay, Dix family is dead. No more Dix. Okay, they're gone. And so, folks, you have to understand, when you die without a will, some states will will act under what's called the law of intestate succession, which is basically where they will write a will for you. There's basically 7 generations of family members that they will try to give your stuff to. And if they can't find somebody in those 7 tiers, the government, the state more specifically, takes ownership of your land. This is a process called escheat. We're going to talk about it. It's a type of involuntary alienation. The government taking your land just by default. Okay, it's called escheat. E-S-C-H-E-A-T. And so in this meeting, somebody's like, there are none of the Dix family left. There is nobody to inherit it. And so then them and their attorneys, the wheels just got turning. Here's what they said, okay? Well, then let's just change it. Let's just change the use of it. So here's what happened, folks. The city of Raleigh changed the use, and they no longer use it as a mental health institution. Oh no, the ownership of the property legally reverted back to the Dix family. There was nobody in the Dix family under the law of intestate succession, and so the state of North Carolina now gained that property by way of escheat. And when they gained it at the same level the Dix family owned it. Fee simple absolute. And then the state of North Carolina gave grant money to the city of Raleigh for the city of Raleigh to turn around and buy the property back from the state of North Carolina, and they can now do whatever they want with the property. Folks, the Dix family is rolling in their graves. This goes to show you, if you ever have wishes, don't you get the government involved, because they will try to find a way to screw you over, and that's what they did. And so, like I said, most of you are not philanthropic billionaires who donated land to the city of Raleigh, and so you don't necessarily understand this on a personal level, but these things happen all the time. I know, you can't make this stuff up. So, I'll give you another example. There is a botanical garden not far from where I live, kind of like the Garner area, and the man who owns it has operated a business, and it's right next to his house. And he has decided that he has no kids, and he is reaching his retirement years. So he's actually donating it to North Carolina State University for them to utilize it as part of their botany and horticulturist programs only. So he is doing basically one of these, right? So there is your explanation. Folks, there will be slides on this, but I'd just like to just kind of walk you through it and explain it, okay? How are we feeling about the left side of this kind of chart here? Everybody okay? So let's talk about the right side, the right side of the freehold. We're not getting into the non-freehold or leasehold yet, but let's talk about the life estates, okay? So this is now where we are limiting timing, okay? Limiting timing. The fee simple to feasible is trying to limit the use. This is not limiting use per se, but this is limiting the time that you will own something. And so there are 2 different really testable types of life estates. One is called a conventional life estate, and the other is called a life estate per ultra V. Now, when we're dealing with a life estate, there are 2 important parties involved. There is what we call the life tenant. Now, I want you to think about this. Don't let this word tenant confuse you. I told you that all of these that we are talking about currently are estates of ownership. The reason we call them a life tenant, though, is because they will ultimately use their ownership because we are limiting the time. And so there is the life tenant, the person who is the owner, and then there is what we call the measuring life. And so a conventional life estate is one where the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person. Let me give you an example. Durrani, I'm giving you a property and you own it so long as you are alive. You are the life tenant, the owner, and you are the measuring life. Folks, how long will Durrani own that property?
As long as
she dies.
Until she dies. You own it for exactly the life of one Durrani. That's what you got. And as such, a conventional life estate is never an estate of inheritance. Now, that's going to be a very important testable aspect. Folks, when I say an estate of inheritance is one that can be willed. So if it is not an estate of inheritance, that means it cannot be willed. And so a conventional life estate cannot be willed, because picture it. Durrani, you own this property so long as you are alive. Folks, when do wills kick in?
When you die.
When you die. So in her will, Durrani says, I'd like to leave this property to my firstborn child. The second you die, your will goes into effect, but it's not yours anymore because you only owned it so long as you were alive and you're not anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, of course, you're probably wondering, well, what happens to the ownership of the property? There are two main outcomes for these life estates. There is what we call a reversionary interest, and I keep using that word. To revert means to go back to where it started. And so if I gave Durrani the property, I'm the grantor, and so it could revert back to me or my heirs. But there is also an option for what we call leaving it to a remainder man, which is a third party. So I could say, Durrani, you own this so long as you are alive, and when you die, it goes to Anna Grace. Anna Grace is the remainder man or woman, as it were. And when Durrani dies, just like that, Anna Grace is the owner. That's why Durrani can't will it. Durrani owned it so long as she was alive. When she dies, it's not hers. I've already named who it's supposed to go to. And so a conventional life estate is never, ever, 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 ever going to be willable. You cannot leave it to anybody. What you got, Alex?
And that cannot be changed after it's purchased. Like if it's on the agreement, that can't be changed. Let's say when I'm 8 years old and I want to die and I want to give it to my kids, that cannot be changed at all.
No, because the person who gave it to you is putting this restriction. The only person who could take this restriction off is the person who gave it to you. You don't have the authority to change it. That's why these are appurtenances, right? That's why these are in these categories. They're stuck. And so, you know, you can't do anything. It's just, that's what you got. You can never give more than what you have, okay? So let me explain the other one. Okay, a life estate per ultra v. Per ultra v is Latin. It basically translates to for the life of another. And so this is where the life tenant and the measuring life are different people. Let me just stick with Durrani. Durrani, you own it so long as Alex is alive. Who is the life tenant? Durrani. And so Alex would be the measuring life. Now, folks, does Alex have any ownership interest in this property at all? No. Alex is a unit of measure. So now, Durrani, you own it for exactly the life of one Alex. We have no idea when that is, how long that is. But notice what happens here. This is potentially an estate of inheritance. Okay? Let me explain why. If Durrani dies, but Alex is still alive, who is technically still legally allowed to be the owner? Durrani. But really no point in dead people owning the property. So if Durrani said in her will that I want to leave this property to my firstborn child, well, she can. Now, how long will her firstborn child own this property?
Until Alex dies.
Until Alex dies. There you go. So long as Alex is alive. See, folks, it's not that complicated. I mean, it's weird it's abstract, but that's in a nutshell. A conventional life estate, the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person. And as such, it's never willable. A life estate per ultra V is potentially inheritable because if the life tenant dies before the measuring life does, it's still theirs to own. Now let me throw you a curveball here. Okay? Let's change it up. I'm going to keep with Durrani. Durrani, you own it so long as your firstborn child is alive. Is this a conventional life estate or a life estate per ultra V?
Say that again.
For Ultra V.
Per ultra V. So Durrani owns the property so long as her firstborn child is alive. So that's a per ultra V, right? Because the life tenant is Durrani. The measuring life is her firstborn child. Everybody cool with that? So in Durrani's will, she puts that when she dies, this property is going to go to her firstborn child. She kicks the bucket. The will kicks in. What does her firstborn child now have?
A conventional life estate.
A conventional life estate. Because they inherited it as the life tenant, and they were the original measuring life, and they still are. Now the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person. Does that make sense? That's it.
What made it revert back to conventional life estate?
What makes it a conventional life estate is that the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person. So when I gave it to Durrani, Durrani was a life tenant, yeah, and then her firstborn child was the measuring life. When she willed it to that child, they became the life tenant, and they were still the measuring life. Now it's the same person.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. What you got, Constantine?
Could you technically choose another measuring life and then have it revert back to a pure ultra V?
Once again, the only person who can choose a different one is the person who set this up in the first place, meaning me.
Okay.
Yeah. You can't do anything when somebody gives this to you. It is what it is kind of thing. You're just stuck. What you got is what you got. You can't change it. The person who put these rules on it can change it.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me give you a couple different spins on this, folks. Just to help you understand and maybe provide some different pieces of clarity. You are an owner, and as such, you could do whatever an owner could do with this property for the most part. Okay? You can live in it. You could rent it out. You could, do a lot of different things. And so let me ask you a question. If you own something in a conventional life estate, do you think you could sell that property?
Yes.
Yes. Sure you could. Folks, you are an owner. But here's the thing. Imagine going and trying to sell a conventional life estate. Okay, so Lisa, you own this property so long as you are alive. And you put this property on the market. You got this conventional life estate and you put this property on the market for sale. And I come up and I'm like, oh my God, that is a beautiful piece of property. I'd love to buy this. And I look at Celisa, I say, Celisa, you own this fee simple absolute? And she said, well, actually, I own it under a conventional life estate. I'm sorry, Celisa, can you speak up? I didn't hear you. Can you say that again? I own it under a conventional life estate. I said, oh, you own it in a conventional life estate? She says, mm-hmm. But you want to buy it? And I said, well, yeah. Now hold on, Celicia. Before I buy this property, I got some questions for you, girl. How old are you? Do you smoke? Do you drink? When's the last time you went skydiving? Do you ever cross the road without looking both ways? We got some issue. Because, folks, if I buy this property, I may own it for 6 minutes if Celicia gets hit by a bus tomorrow, right? Or I may own it for another 90 years. We got some things to talk about before you sell this property. So can you sell it? Of course you can. But who in their right mind wants to buy it not knowing how long they're going to own it for? Because it could be 5 minutes, it could be 90 years. You see how that works? Same thing's true. Do you think you could borrow money against this property?
Yes.
Same answer. Yeah, but when you go to the banks and say, I'd like to borrow money, they're going to say, great, do you own it fee simple absolute so you can put a lien on it? You're going to say, no, it's a conventional life estate. They're going to say, listen, we'll let you borrow about $10 because we don't know you that well, okay? And we don't know when you're going to kick the bucket, so we'll give you about $10 and a pack of bubble gum. Best we can do, right? It's like Pawn Stars. Best we can do is a pack of bubble gum and $10. That's all we got. Shia says, if you buy it from her, it changes to life estate per Ultra V. Absolutely. If I buy it, now I am the life tenant, and I own it so long as Celicia is alive. And now it's a life estate per Ultra V. There you go. Like I said, abstract, weird, unique, but really not that bad if you just listen to it piece by piece. You agree? Not terrible. Now, do understand, I'm going to give you more than that. You're going to see some slides to reinforce this, but I just find that in my years of teaching this, if I just slowly explain it to you and kind of give you some basic comparisons, you have a good, solid foundation of things to group it to as we get into the more in-depth piece and the slides. But really, if you're feeling comfortable, then you're doing great. This is testable, not a crazy amount of questions, but definitely testable. So when we're talking about these freehold estates, I've already said this is just the solidifying it. I told you, we basically are trying to limit one of two things in these different examples. We are limiting the time, in other words, how long you own the property, life estates, or we're limiting your use, fee simple to feasible, also called qualified fee. Now, I do want to make sure you understand when we talked about the or and e words, folks, when you own a piece of property where there is a deed, and that deed is the document that shows the transfer of title. And so we always name the grantor, which is the giver, and the grantee, which is the person who receives the property. Okay? So I keep using that term. Revert back to the grantor or the grantor's heirs, meaning the person who gave you the property. It doesn't matter if it's will, doesn't matter if it's sold, doesn't matter. There will be some type of deed that shows the transfer of title from grantor to grantee, whether it be through sale or otherwise. Now, I kind of think I mentioned this a little bit, folks, but let me just make sure you understand, okay? I keep talking about the Register of Deeds, and I keep talking about deeds. The deed, and we're going to get into that in depth later tonight. The deed, as I keep saying, is the document that shows the transfer of title. Remember, title is a concept of ownership in real estate. When you're talking about your car, when you're talking about personal property, there is a physical document called a title. There is not a physical document called a title in real estate. It's this concept of ownership. If you are said to hold title, you are presumably the owner. But what shows that title is transferred to you is these documents called a deed. And when I say Register of Deeds, that is the public record. It is a history book, if you will, of all the conveyances for many different properties. And the Register of Deeds is a physical location. It is a room in the county courthouse. If we're dealing with Wake County, it is at the courthouse in Raleigh. It's called the Register of Deeds. You can go in there and you can look at these big fat books that have all these past deeds that are stored in this room. It's like a library of these books. So when you look online, that is a digital catalog of the physical Register of Deeds. And in some counties, they're more outdated and they don't have the catalog like Raleigh does. You would have to actually do a title search at the physical Register of Deeds office. And so understand that each time that property is conveyed, a new deed is drafted up. There is no such thing as the deed. There is the most recent deed, but there is a lot of deeds that are for each conveyance, right? From this person to this person, this person to this person, this person to this person. And it goes back hundreds of years in some cases. Now, when we're talking about deeds, and I've said this before, I think as well too, every single deed should link to the last one. So I keep talking about, oh, I gave you property. Well, if I gave you property, I am the or, you are the E, right? It's showing where that title is transferring from me to you. On the previous deed, I should be the E, and there should be somebody else that was the or that transferred that title to me. That person should be the E on the previous deed. So they all link together. That's what we call chain of title. We're going to talk about that more tonight as well. But this shows where one person conveyed it to another person, conveyed it to another person, conveyed it to another person, so we can figure out who is the legal owner of record as it sits right now. That's why there is no single deed. There is a lot of deeds showing all these conveyances. And I told you they can go back for a while. Now that I've kind of explained deeds and I've explained these different types of estates to you, folks understand that one of the most testable aspects of a lot of different categories, and this included, is whether or not it can be willed. Okay? That is hands down one of the most testable aspects. And so, as I said earlier, we break that into two categories. Okay? Estates of inheritance and estates not of inheritance. An estate of inheritance is one that can be willed. Anytime you see the word fee on that list that we just talked about, that is an estate of inheritance. Now, you're never going to actually see the language on that chart that says non-fee, but for example, a life estate would not be a fee estate. So fee always means inheritable. If it's not fee, then it's not inheritable. But don't get so caught up on those words because very seldom are those actually tested in that regard. But that's just an important note to note. A note to note.
Does fee stand for something?
It's just legal verbiage. Yeah. Like I said, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when they were like coming up with names for all this stuff because it's all been around for a very long time. They're like, we're going to call it fee simple, subject to a condition subsequent. And everybody's in the room's like, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. That's not a mouthful at all. We should definitely call it that. Why would we not? Now, folks, I want you to think about it. On this list that I just showed you of all of those freehold estates, there was only one that was not an estate of inheritance. Without even looking at the list, which one was it? Conventional life estate. There you go. Every other one is potentially inheritable. That should be really easy to remember on the test. The only one that is not ever inheritable is a conventional life estate. And they will ask you all kinds of inheritance questions. All kinds. So they will say something like, Josh owns a life estate Pearl Trevis so long as Adam Sandler is alive. Josh passes away, but Adam Sandler is alive. In Josh's will, he wants to leave this property to his best friend, Steve, who is now the owner of the property now that Josh has passed away. Well, it's going to be Steve because Adam Sandler, the measuring life, is still alive, and Josh, the life tenant, died, and so it could be willed. Then they'll give you another scenario, and they'll say, well, such and such owned it as a conventional life estate and left a will. Folks, this is what probate is. Probate is where we legally take a look at your will and your wishes, and we decide, can they be upheld or not? Because, folks, if you put in your will that you want to leave a conventional life estate to somebody, it can't be adhered to. They're going to say, nope, can't do it. It's not theirs to give. And so probate will say, nah, Slick, that doesn't go to you, even though he said it in his will. It would be like me dying and saying that Tara's house is going to Ray. It's not my house to give, is it? I can't just put that in my will. Like, no, it's a dead man. He said it. We got to listen. No, doesn't work that way. Does that make sense for everybody? So the only one of the freehold estates, these estates of ownership that we talked about that cannot ever be willed, is a conventional life estate because the life tenant and the measuring life are the same. The rest of these could be willed, but remember, as I said before, you can only give what you have. If it's a determinable where you can only use it as a horse farm, you can only will it as determinable for a horse farm. If it's fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, you can use it forever you want as long as it's never a church. You could will it, you could gift it, you could sell it, but the same rules still apply. Everybody still okay? Good deal. So, when we're dealing with this, like I said, if y'all are feeling comfortable, I mean, y'all have really got the bulk of the complexities down for this. It really is not much more complicated than this at all. And so I will provide one distinction here. Understand that right now, when I'm talking about to what extent you own a property, to what level you have an estate in a property, and you have this freehold estate, which is an estate of ownership, I keep saying you can only give what you have. Now, you'll find later that when we talk about different types of deeds, you can use any type of deed regardless of the deed that was given to you. Don't confuse the two. It's a type of a deed versus the ownership being conveyed on the deed. Very different concepts, okay? But you can only give what type of ownership you have. Never anything more. Only the person who put these limitations, these restrictions, these whatever, could remove them. You don't have the power to do that. So here's where you get the slides that go over everything that I just explained to you piece by piece, okay? When I say fee simple absolute, that means highest and best form of ownership. No restrictions on time, no restrictions on use. At least not to the extent that it would ever be powerful enough to lose your ownership. We're not saying that there are no restrictive covenants. We're not saying that there are no zoning rules, okay? We're just saying that nobody's restricted your use from a legal ownership capacity. And folks, 99% of people in the world own property fee simple absolute. Remember on the test, I told you fee simple and fee simple absolute are interchangeable. So if they say such and such owns a property fee simple, read it as fee simple absolute. So when you're getting anything less than fee simple absolute, I keep saying it, the two things that we would be restricting, time and use. If we're limiting time, it's a type of life estate. If we're limiting use, it's a type of fee simple defeasible. And of course, there are those two subcategories. So and folks, by the way, be very careful, because one of the hardest parts about this is that these words sound similar. Think about it. Determinable is a type of defeasible. But they sound very similar. Don't get them confused, okay? Defeasible is the broad category, also called what? What was the other name for defeasible?
Qualified fee.
Qualified fee. So that's the broad category saying that we're limiting your use in some way, shape, or form. The two specific subcategories were fee simple determinable and fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. Mouthful, I know. And then we're dealing with life estates, okay? Those are limiting time. They're both life estates. One is called a conventional life estate, where the life tenant and the measuring life are the same. And one is called a life estate per ultra V, where the measuring life and life tenant are different. You just got to keep these straight. Folks, create some flashcards. Just study it. It's not that hard. It's just the language is so similar, it gets confusing. So when we're talking about the defeasible, okay, also called qualified fee, you got the determinable, you got the fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. Here is just some supplemental notes here, as I've already explained it to you. Okay, defeasible is the broad category. Then you've got the two subcategories within. Also remember, defeasible sounds like defeated. You could defeat your own ownership. Qualified fee, you have to qualify for your own ownership. So defeasible, qualified, the broad category. Just make sure you keep them straight on the test. What you got, Jamila?
No, I just wanted to confirm that you'll be putting these slides into the group me.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
You got it. So here is the slide for these specific categories, okay? And using the examples that I've already taught you. Fee simple, determinable. This one allowable use. Mark grants ownership of a property to Susan as long as she only ever uses it as a horse farm. Told you I was going to talk you through it, and then I was going to give you slides to solidify what we talked about. One use and one use only. That is fee simple determinable. We have determined the allowable use. Now, the other thing that I told you that I think you could potentially see on the test, understand that the way that this is interpreted legally is if you break the rule, it automatically reverts, okay? Even though it has not been a court hearing, if you break the rule, it is said to automatically revert to the grantors or the grantors' heirs, okay? Termination is automatic. And so think of the language here. It has one allowable use. And so in other words, you can own this property so long as you only ever use it as a horse farm, until you stop using it as a horse farm, during the time you are using it as a horse farm, while you are following the rules, however you want to interpret this. where there is this grouping of words that kind of helps you understand. You've got to follow this one rule. And if you don't, it automatically reverts back to the grantors or the grantors' heirs.
Does this revert back to the original grantor? So say if I had one of these and then I sell it to somebody and they don't do what they're supposed to, does it come back to me or the heirs of the person I bought it from?
The heirs of the person you bought it from, the person who set those rules.
Okay.
Yeah. What you got, Alex?
All of these rules and everything that you have to follow is going to be on the deed, right?
It's going to be clearly outlined on the deed, absolutely. There is no guessing game. It would say it as plain as day.
So if it's not written, you can legally not follow it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. And that's the point. You know, some people don't care. You know, when I sell my property, when I get my property, some people just don't care what happens to it next. The only time we do this is if we care what happens to it in the future. And as I said, more often than not, it's the philanthropic billionaires donating land who do this. Most of us will never, because we just want the money and we're gone. What you got, Jamila?
Okay, so will one of these be specified on the deed, or if nothing is specified, are we assuming that it's the absolute?
Excellent question. It will have to be specified on the deed. Let me show you something here. I'm going to pull this up just to show you. I'm going to use this thing. I'm going to leave it up, or I'm going to leave it where I can get to it easily, because I like to use this as an example when we get into the actual deed section, but you are asking good questions. Let me do, I believe it's here is where I have it saved. Give me 1 second. Here you go. Here, what I'm pulling up right now is a copy of a deed, an actual deed from a house being transferred not far from where I live. Once it loads here. And I saved this deed as I was just kind of like searching for stuff one day because I thought it was a very good example of a lot of different concepts we're going to talk about in this class, if it loads here. But you'll be able to see the exact verbiage, the exact language that dictate what kind of ownership was transferred. And I'll tell you what, I'll circle back and I'll show it to you. I'll let the next person ask the question, and I want to show you this when it finishes loading. My computer's just mad at me right now, but it'll come up. So hold that thought, Jamila. What you got, Cheyenne?
So let's say I have a fee simple determinable. I have this horse farm. Can I keep it as a horse farm and have like a bed and breakfast at it, per se?
It would be very dependent on what they put in there. I mean, for a fee simple determinable, it would have to say, can be used as a horse farm bed and breakfast combo. Like, it would have to be so specific, because that's kind of the whole point is setting these rules. So there's no, like, you know, it's whatever the owners decide. It's whatever the conveyance says. It's whatever, you know, was discussed. Why is this not opening? Why is it so mad at me? What you got, Celicia?
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to summarize it for myself. So let's say I'm an owner and I'm under, you know, fee simple absolute, and I've got the house paid off. I don't owe anybody anything, and I decide to sell it to. I'd basically be able to sell it to someone under fee simple determinable or fee simple defeasible, and I put a stipulation under there for the same examples of a horse farm where you can't sell alcohol. Would it basically start with me as far as, you know, that rule, as far as like following anybody that sells it or resells it? If they don't follow those rules, it comes back to me and my heirs. If I put it in a will, if I pass, like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's whoever conveyed the ownership with the rule that was so powerful that it would revert. Now, please understand, Celicia, because it sounds like you're scheming over there. You're like, I'm going to get this property back for my family. You've ruined the value of the property. Nobody wants to buy anything with rules where they could lose it. It's typically gifted, right? Could it be sold? Yes, but good luck trying to sell it to somebody where you're like, I'm going to write in all these sneaky things so they're going to lose it. They're going to read it. Title search is going to say, listen, she put all these rules on there that you got to follow. So you have ruined the value of your property by doing that.
Okay, sometimes I have to give myself like a different type of scenario that puts myself.
Sure,
like
I get it. But like I said, sometimes I teach like such unique concepts that like students will be like, oh, I'm gonna do this tomorrow. And then I have to be like, hold the horses, okay? It's not as glamorous as it sounds because there's a lot of hoops to jump through. Can y'all see the copy of this deed on my screen right here? Finally got it up. That was good. I answered some questions. So here you go, Jamila. If you look right here, witnesseth that the grantors for valuable consideration paid by the grantee, the receipt of which is hereby acknowledged, has and by these presents does grant, bargain, sell, and convey unto the grantee in fee simple. And so I told you fee simple is interpreted as fee simple absolute. That means they own this property fee simple absolute. But it would also, if it was intended to be anything else, and I don't want you to read too much into this because it's a really good example of some other stuff, but I don't want you to get too ahead. It would say fee simple determinable or fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, and then it would outline the rules and the expectations right there in that section. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I'll tell you what, I think y'all can handle it because y'all are a really smart bunch, okay? I moved it off because that deed is actually, while it was transferring ownership fee simple, that is actually an example of a conventional life estate. Let me show you what I mean here. Because we've got the grantors and we got the grantees, and they're transferring fee simple, but then it goes on to say, subject to the life estate of the grantors, which is reserved herein. In other words, this is basically a deed that's set up to bypass probate. What that means is Donald Ray Hicks and wife Shirley Griffin Hicks own it so long as they are alive. So they own a conventional life estate. They basically left this to these people that when they die, it goes to them. And so that's what it says, subject to the life estate of the grantors. When they die, these people right here are the remainder men, and they will inherit it fee simple absolute. Does that make sense? This is what it looks like in the real world. Celicia, is your hand just up from before?
Yeah.
No worries. So I'll actually use that deed as a couple other examples of things as we get into the deeper layers of these conversations, okay? But fee simple determinable, one allowable use. Then we've got this other one. Fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, sometimes just called fee simple subject to a condition. And so I gave you a couple examples already. Thomas purchased a property that allows him to do whatever he wants except sell alcohol on the property. You can do anything but this one thing. Okay, anything but this one thing. Now the important clarification notes that I gave you earlier for this fee simple subject to a condition subsequent, you must not perform some action. The other thing that I said is there is no automatic reversion with this one. You are said to be able to regain it by way of a court hearing. You would have to actually take the owner to court to get your ownership back, presumably so they can remedy the situation and not lose it. So termination is not automatic for this. And so the language, kind of similarly speaking, has a grouping of language. What you got, Alex?
And if the owner dies, you got to get it by the state, correct?
If if the owner dies, well, I guess expand on your question so I can make sure I'm answering what you were asking.
So if you take the owner to court, but the owner is dead and he doesn't have anybody else under him to, like, let's say there's no more.
The owner that you would be taking to court would be the person who did not do what they were supposed to do, and the person who would be doing that was the grantor. Now, I mean, if the owner dies and wills this to their kid and their kid's not doing it, once again, it would be the heirs of the original grantor going after the heirs of the original grantee in court to get it back. Yeah. So not automatic, involves that court. Okay, termination not automatic. They must go to court to try to regain their ownership. And so here's some language that goes with that, okay? It is yours to do whatever you want, but if you do this one thing, it's not yours anymore, provided that you don't do this one thing, on the condition that you don't do this one thing. Everybody still feeling okay? It's not too scary, right? It's just kind of a pain. Okay? Like, it's gross. It's annoying. It's not too bad. Like I said, the good news is there's not 10 billion questions in regard to this, but it is definitely testable. And please understand that you could see questions in both North Carolina and national. I mean, this exists in every state. So here's where you get to see on screen what we call reversionary interest and remainder interest. I already explained it to you. Reversionary, the root word is to revert, to go back to where it started. So if something has a reversionary interest, it goes back to the grantor. If the grantor is dead, then it would go to the grantor's heirs. Okay, that is a reversionary interest. Then if we have a remainder interest, that means we've named somebody for it to go to. That's all it means. Now, there are a lot of different types of these things that could have both, but we most commonly discuss these for these life estates. Okay, now please understand that if we don't name somebody, the default for a life estate is a reversionary interest. Okay, so Cheyenne owns the property so long as Cheyenne is alive. Well, first and foremost, would that be a conventional life estate or would that be a life estate per Ultra V? Conventional life estate. There you go. I did not name anything else, did I? All I said is Cheyenne owns it so long as she's alive. You agree? When you do not name anybody else, the default is when Cheyenne dies, it goes back to the grantor. It is automatic reversion if we have not named a third party. Now let me change it. Cheyenne owns it so long as Cheyenne is alive, and when she passes, Tyvolia owns it. Tyvolia is the remainder man, remainder woman. And so now, if Cheyenne passes away, who is going to be the owner of the property? Tyvolia. And so if we do not name a remainder man, it's reversionary. But if we name one, that is who we're naming it to go to next. Now, folks, please understand, if you thought ahead enough, you could basically outline that a property has like 6 consecutive life estates, right? I could say Cheyenne owns this so long as she's alive, and when she passes, Tyvolia gets it. And then Tyvolia gets it so long as she's alive, and then when Tyvolia passes, Denise gets it. Then Denise owns it so long as she's alive. You could basically outline the property to transfer by way of like 15 consecutive life estates. Now, of course, because we're all going to live very similar lifespans, that wouldn't make much sense for all the people in this room. But what I could say is the firstborn child of the secondborn child of the thirdborn child of this person, assuming that they're there, if you wanted to create enough legal crap on a piece of paper, you could. But these are typically very well thought out and designed by intention. So here's where we circle back around to what I already told you. Life estates, we got the conventional, not willable. The life tenant and the measuring life are the two parties. They're the same person in a conventional life estate, which is why it's not willable. And then the life estate for per Ultra V, what is that? For life of another. The life tenant and the measuring life are different people. And so that means, folks, as I said before, if the life tenant dies before the measuring life dies, then you could potentially will it. But then they would just own it until that measuring life passed away.
How common are life estates?
Probably more common than you'd realize. It is a way, as you just saw in that deed, for people to leave stuff to their kids and bypass probate. Because, you know, probate can be a long, arduous process where they have to make sure that all claims are settled and nobody else has a right to the process or to the property. And so some people will do that, and so that means their kids own the property automatically when they die. And so, like you saw in that one, they reserved a life estate. Let me give you another example, folks. When we get into... Let me hold off on this example, actually. I was going to introduce a new concept, but I'll wait until I teach you the concept, and then I'll circle back around and kind of tie it back into a really prominent example of when you would use a life estate in a practical point of view. But they're pretty common, believe it or not. What you got, McKinney?
This might be a silly question.
Then don't ask it. Just stop it. No, I'm kidding.
Does the measurable life named have to be alive when it's written? Like, let's say it's like my great-great-grandchild. That's my measurable life.
Oh, yeah. Legally speaking, no. Well, it would have to make sense. You can write whatever you want, but it would have to make sense. It wouldn't make sense for you to say, Seth, you own it so long as my great-great-great-great future-born grandchild is alive. That wouldn't make any sense, would it? Because I'm going to die long before they die. So what was the point of even drafting that? Now, if you're trying to say that, you could potentially keep a property in the family. When the oldest of this generation dies, it will go to the oldest of the next generation. When the oldest of that generation dies, it will go to the oldest of the next generation. And then you could that way guarantee that a property stayed in the family. Of course, there's other ways to do that, like setting up trust. But of course, when trusts run out of money, there's nobody overseeing it anymore. So there's different ways that you could tackle that. But yeah. So the life tenant, I told you, is the person who owns it, okay? Don't get so caught up on the word tenant. The only reason we call them a tenant is because we can all agree that they will not own it forever. Folks, everybody dies. It's a guarantee, okay? Until we become those Futurama heads in the water, we all die, and it just is what it is. And so the life tenant is called that because they will only own it for a period of one life of somebody. And as I said, an owner can do what they want. If you own a property, you could rent it out. You could live in it. You could, sell it. You could borrow money against it. But you still only have and can only give what you have. So the life tenant is the owner. And then the other party that we worry about in a life estate relationship is the measuring life. Okay? And if they're the same person, conventional life estate. If they're different people, life estate per ultra V. As I said, y'all are pretty sharp, and I think you got this down pat, but let me just give you a couple examples here, okay, to make sure you've got this. Mark owns the property until he dies, and then it will go to Megan. So let's answer two different questions, okay? The first question is, based on the measuring life, is this a conventional life estate or a per ultra V scenario?
Per ultra V.
Conventional.
Got to read it carefully. Mark owns the property until Mark dies. So Mark is the measuring life and the life tenant. So this is a conventional life estate. And then when we're dealing with who owns it in the end, would this be a remainder interest or would this be a reversionary interest? Remainder. Because it will go to a third party, Megan. Don't get confused. There is somebody else other than Mark, but that person's the remainder man. And so they are not making this a per ultra V scenario. Life tenant and measuring life are the same person, Mark. We've named a third party for it to go to, so it is an estate of remainder. Now, folks, let me introduce another piece of language here. While Mark's alive, does Megan have any ownership interest in this property?
No.
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 But can we all agree that Mark will die and Megan will probably have an ownership interest in this property?
Yes.
Yes. There is a legal term for that. It's called an estate in remainder. Because estate just means what level of interest or relationship do you have to the property. Megan's relationship to the property is she will eventually own it. It's called an estate in remainder. Now, if you were the grantor and it was a reversionary interest, you would have what's called an estate in reversion. Because you will get it back when somebody dies, or your heirs will. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
There you go. What you got, Alex?
So it does not matter how long they're alive for, right? Like Megan can kill him, an example, and get that property back. Because that's how it's written, right?
Sure, she'd go to jail, but she would be the legal owner while she's in jail.
No, I'm asking if there's a time span on after let's say a year, then you could legally own it when I die. That's what I was asking.
Yeah, there's no time frame. It's quite literally when that person stops breathing, it changes ownership. Could be 5 minutes, could be 5 years, could be 90 years. Hell, if they're on life support, in an iron lung for 200 years, arguably, if they're still alive, legally speaking, there's no time frame.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Just for clarification, conventional life estates never inheritable.
Never inheritable. Never.
Who is measuring, like, I guess I'm getting twisted on conventional.
Conventional, well, hold on now. This conventional life estates just means that the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person. Don't confuse that with we've got a remainder man to say who it goes to when they die. So let me give you an example using this scenario right here, okay? Mark owns the property so long as Mark is alive. That makes it a conventional life estate. And so when Mark dies, it automatically goes to the remainder man, Megan. But imagine that Mark had a will that stated, when I die, I want this property to go to Rob. It will not. Probate will say it's not Mark's to give because Mark only owned it so long as Mark was alive. He died, his life estate died, and the life estate named a third-party remainder man for it to go to, Megan, at his death. Probate will be ignored. Don't get confused just because there's another party in here. That other party is who's going to own it when Mark dies. The remainder man.
Gotcha.
Yep. And I'm sorry, you've been so patient, Darlene. What was your question?
Yeah, because I thought I got it, but now I feel like I'm a little confused with the per RTV because I thought that meant they get it after somebody dies, like they name somebody.
No. Hold on. Let me give you another example, folks. Hang tight because you got to understand. Okay, looking at this, who is a life tenant? Who is the measuring life on this sheet?
It's Mark.
Mark. And so when the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person, that is a conventional life estate.
Conventional life, okay.
But we have named somebody for it to go to when his life estate ends. Don't confuse that with somebody else being the life, the measuring life. Megan's not the measuring life. Mark is.
Right, she's the remainder.
She's the remainder man. That's all it is. And that's why I'm giving you these examples because when you see that extra name on the test, your brain's going to try to think, Pro Tree, don't you do it. You've got to understand who is the life tenant, who is the measuring life. If they are the same, it is a conventional life estate. Even if you see another name, as you do here, Megan is a remainder man, a third party that it will go to when this conventional life estate ends. And if Megan was not in here, if we just said Mark owns the property until Mark dies and nothing else, then it's a reversionary interest because that's the default. It would go back to whoever gave it to Mark or their heirs and assigns is what we call it. Everybody with me? What you got, Jamila?
I'm stuck. You done broke it down a good 3 or 4 times and I'm still stuck. Okay, so I get how it's conventional.
Okay.
But I don't get, and then it will go to Megan. Like, if it cannot be willed, who is saying it's going to Megan?
Me. Mark. I'm sorry, whoever gave it to Mark. Let's say I gave this property to Mark, okay? I look at Mark. I'm the grantor, okay? I own this property. Well, let's say it's a beautiful beach house. And Mark's a friend of mine. And I say, Mark, I'm going to give you ownership of my beach house so long as you are alive. Mark, I just granted Mark a conventional life estate. Because I said Mark owns it so long as Mark is alive. So you understand why that's a conventional life estate.
Yeah, I get that.
Okay? And so here's what I said. All right, Mark, you own it so long as you are alive. But I've got a friend who's much younger than you and probably outlive you named Megan. And so when you die, it's going to Megan. I have stated when that time is up, because we can all agree his time will be up. When that conventional life estate ends, that property has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. And so I've stated when his time is up, I want it to go to Megan. I set that in place.
Okay.
So Mark, you own it so long as you are alive, and when you kick the bucket, I want it to go to Megan. No ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts. It would say that on the deed. So when Mark dies, Megan is the owner. All we would need is a copy of the death certificate from Mark to show now that Megan is the owner.
Okay.
And I could even put on there that Megan will own it fee simple absolute. Think about the life estate that I just showed you. Folks, these grantees are actually not getting ownership. They are being named as remainder men in a conventional life estate. So this is actually the owners granting themselves a conventional life estate. And what they're basically saying is when we die, it's a conventional life estate because they're the life tenants and the measuring life. When we die, it is going to go fee simple to Denise Michelle Hicks and Daniel Anthony Garver. So this is a conventional life estate naming their remainder men who will own it fee simple absolute. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kinda. It's complex, right? It's complex. Yeah. What you got, Priya?
Is it like, so it's safe to say, kind of think of it this way, like pure ultra V, it means like a state for life of another. So like another person being the measurable life.
That's it.
But if you like remember that it just means a state for life of another, you'll like be able to differentiate it from conventional.
Yeah, and so the two big things that you're going to, three big things, you're going to need to be able to tell me what a conventional life estate is, and that is a life estate where the life tenant and the measuring life are the same person. You're going to have to tell me what a per ultra V is. That is a life estate where the measuring life and the life tenant are different people. And then you're going to have to potentially be able to discern, is it a life estate with a reversionary interest, meaning we didn't name anybody for it to go to after the end of this life estate, so it's going to go back to the initial grantor, or we did name somebody for it to go to when it ends, and that's with a remainder, or a remainder man. That's it. What you got, Alex?
No, you kind of answered. I was just asking just to make sure what does per entry V, whatever that means again. I was just being kind of answering.
Yeah, for the life of another. So a life estate per ultra V means the life tenant and the measuring life are different people. Priya owns it so long as Jim Carrey is alive. Folks, Jim Carrey does not need to know that he's a unit of measure. There's no rule stating that. Priya is the life tenant, and she will own it for the life of one Jim Carrey. That is a life estate per ultra V. When Jim Carrey kicks the bucket, Priya doesn't own it anymore. And if we did not name another person for it to go to, it will revert back to the grantor. And if we did name another person for it to go to, it will go to them. It's called a remainder man.
So if Jim Carrey dies and it goes back to the grantor, but what if you, being the grantor, had also passed away? Would it be?
It goes to my heirs. Nope.
Your heirs.
My heirs. Remember the Dix family. If I have a son, it'll go to him. If he is dead, but he has a son, it'll go to him. The law of intestate succession will kick in. The courts will say, it's supposed to go to Seth. Seth's not alive. Does he have any living family members? That's why I keep saying heirs or assigns. I could set up in my estate who would get all my stuff if it came back to me. And if I don't set that up, the law of intestate succession says, whoever survives me and my family.
And could that go back, like, down any chain of remaining family? Could it be like your second cousin, third child, once removed, or something crazy like that?
It would follow lineage, and so for me, it can only go to like 7 tiers. And so the way that they look at it in North Carolina, and this is not testable, but if you have a surviving spouse, it goes to them first. If you don't have a spouse, it goes to kids. If you don't have kids, it goes to parents. If you don't have parents, it goes to siblings. If you don't have siblings, it goes to first cousins, and then it goes to like first nieces and nephews. And I think that's where it dies in North Carolina. But what I mean is, if it went to me and I was dead but I had kids, it would go to my kids. But if then my kids die, it could go to their kids. It would restart their because they inherited it. Now it'd be a new set of 7 for them because they did legally exist. And this is why attorneys make the big bucks, folks. Don't worry your pretty little heads about all the minutia of what could happen. It's complex. That's why they make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Let's try another one to make sure you're comfortable, folks. Batman owns the property until Robin dies. Is this a conventional life estate or a life estate per ultra V?
Per
ultra V.
Per ultra V.
Batman is a life tenant. Robin is the measuring life. Everybody cool with that?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a per ultra V. Now, is this one with remainder or reversion? Reversion. Why?
Because it's not going to anyone else.
We didn't name anybody for it to go to. And so the default is to revert back to the grantor or the grantor's heirs. Nailed it. Feel better?
Yeah.
And just to make sure, it can never be a remainder if it's a pure RVT or whatever.
Per ultra V? No, it absolutely can be a remainder if it's a per ultra V. The thing is, we would just state who it goes to after. Batman owns the property until Robin dies, and then it goes to the Joker. That would be a per ultra V with remainder. because we have named a third party for it to go to. That's the only thing that makes it with a remainder. We said who gets it when this life estate ends. That's what makes it remainder. Conventional life estates can have remainder men. Parochial V can have remainder men. Don't confuse that. It's just if we don't name a third party for it to go to, it's reversionary interest. Goes back to the grantor or the grantor's heirs.
Okay.
Let me give you one more. Samantha owns a property until her sister dies. At that point, it will go to Microsoft. Conventional life estate or Parochial V? Who is the life tenant? Samantha. Who is the measuring life? Her sister. Absolutely Parochial V. Now, is this a remainder or a reversion? Remainder. Who is the remainder man? Microsoft. Bam. You get it?
Got it.
Yes.
Go take a break. You've earned it. Come back at 8:40.
Oh, Lord.
Oh, Lord is right. Lord. Yeah.
Slides help. That was a good touch.
Yep, there you go. Everybody having fun? Excited? Loving estates? So much fun. Absolutely. Couldn't be any. Listen, if it was any more fun, it'd probably be illegal, folks. Uh-huh. Just meet somebody in the back alleys. You got any more of them estates conversations? You want to talk about freehold estates? I just need a little bit. Just enough to get me through until the next class. Just enough to get me through the next class, right? It's a good old Dave Chappelle reference right there, if you know what I mean. Make sure you get your cameras on so I know you're with us. Folks, as I said before, this section is nobody's favorite by any means, okay? It's really not, but it is testable, and it's also one of those things that the more you see it, the more you talk about it, the more you just kind of expose yourself to it, it becomes comfortable, okay? It's the reason you don't like it is, as I mentioned, these are all things that you probably never heard of or thought about once in your life, which makes them a little more difficult to understand, but y'all seem to be grasping them very well, or at least you're faking it very well, because as I said, nobody is still crying, at least not that I can see, right? Sometimes lighting can help cover that up, so hopefully that is the case. So the life estate is just one of those interesting things, and just kind of keeping them straight, just like some of the other ones we talked about. And so that's what we're having to decide now. I've added in this layer that kind of confused you for a second, but you seem to be grasping it better now, is, well, what happens to the property when this life estate ends? Because it will end. Both of them will end, okay? We're not going to leave this property up for like this crazy land grab, and so that's where it's either going to be reversionary or remainder interest. And so that's what we just taught you. If we don't state anything of who it goes to after that life estate ends, it's an automatic reversionary interest. And it goes back to the grantor, the person who granted that life estate, or if that person is dead, their heirs and assigns. I keep using that language, but basically anybody that we outline would be entitled to our stuff in our estate, or if we don't have that set up in our estates, then the law of intestate succession kicks in, which is where they basically write a will for us and would give it to our next of kin, depending on the state you were in. So, as we broke it down, okay, we talked about these freehold estates versus non-freehold estates. And I said these freehold estates are estates of ownership. Non-freehold estates are not of ownership. What did I say the other name for non-freehold estates was?
Leasehold.
Leasehold. So, as we've already stated, folks, if you are renting a house or a piece of property, you do have an interest. You do have a relationship to it, don't you? Sure you do. And so the non-freehold, also called leasehold estates, those really come up in a later section. But I am going to go ahead and just introduce them. Now, folks, here's the thing. They've got crazy names, but they're actually exceptionally straightforward. So this is just a real quick introduction. Not going to go too crazy in depth here, because we will talk more about them in the landlord-tenant relationship section. But when we say non-freehold, aka leasehold, There are 4 categories, okay? And what changes them is basically how they end. Let me explain. We've got estate for years, periodic tenancy, estate at will, and estate at sufferance. Now, folks, let me explain something to you. There are a lot of concepts in the real estate education classroom that are not anything like they sound like. And so let me use this estate for years as an example. If you read those words, estate for years, how long does your brain want to tell you that that probably goes on for?
Years.
Years. It sounds like it, doesn't it? Folks, understand that the period of time is not a consideration in this estate for years. Let me explain what an estate for years is. An estate for years is basically a lease that has a very specific start date and end date. When it's done, get out. And so let me give you 2 examples of this. Let's start with a really long one. Folks, commercial leases are typically an estate for years. If you rent a restaurant building for 10 years, it's got a start date, it's got an end date, 10 years later. At the end of that 10 years, you are either getting out or you are renegotiating a new lease, but it ends. Does that make sense? Well, believe it or not, if you rent a beach house for 4 days, it is also an estate for years. Folks, you got a checkout time at that beach house, don't you? You better get out, otherwise they're going to charge you for more time. Get out. Go. And so do you see why that verbiage can be misleading? Estate for years, automatically think, oh, long periods of time. No. The only thing that makes it an estate for years is that the end date is very specific. When it's done, it's done. So vacation rentals and commercial leases are prime examples of an estate for years. When you're renting real estate, residential real estate for long-term rentals, they are not an estate for years. Folks, if you are renting right now, do you know what is written into the end of your residential lease right now in North Carolina? In other words, what happens at the end of it? Does it just automatically end?
You have the option to renew your lease, typically.
Yeah, and let me get more specific than that. Folks, all residential leases in North Carolina are periodic tenancy. And so what will happen is there will be a time frame, and it will basically say, you have to give us notice within 60 days of the end of your lease of your intent to not renew. Otherwise, it will automatically renew. Now, they could automatically renew for another year, could be 6 months, or it could be month to month. But all residential leases in North Carolina legally start out as a periodic tenancy where they will automatically renew if no notice is given of your intent to terminate the lease. You see the difference? An estate for years, when it's done, it's done. Periodic tenancy, also sometimes referred to as an estate from period to period, will automatically renew if no notice is given of your intent to terminate. That's it. That's all that this comes down to differentiate between an estate for years and a periodic tenancy. That's it. That's not too bad, right?
Are most states like that or just ours?
Most are, but not all. Residential leases, residential laws get very state specific. So not all, by any means. So let me explain an estate at will, folks. And the simplest way of teaching it, an estate at will is you're here with permission. Let me give you an example of that. I had a buddy who was getting divorced. He was a really good friend of mine. And he was in the process of buying a house as he was getting divorced and, wasn't closing on it yet. So I said, well, don't worry about it, man. You can stay with me until you close on your other house. That's an estate at will. He was living in my house with permission. I didn't charge him anything. We didn't talk about a period of time. That's all an estate at will is. I have given you permission to be here. Stay here as long as you like. Stay here until you get back on your feet. Stay here until you close on your house. If you give somebody permission to occupy your property, and you haven't really talked about how long that's for, you haven't really talked about money, at least not specifically, it's probably an estate at will. They're with permission, but that's about all we know. Does that make sense? The last one is called an estate at sufferance. An estate at sufferance is basically somebody who gained possession of a property, meaning occupying a property, in one of these legal regards first, one of these first three. But when their time was up or they were asked to leave, they didn't. That's an estate at sufferance. You have overstayed your welcome. Your lease is up, you're supposed to be gone, but you're still here. That's an estate at sufferance. That's it. Same thing as a holdover tenant. You're supposed to be gone, but you're not. That's an estate at sufferance. Now, please understand that this is not the only time you'll see these. As I said, these come back up in the landlord-tenant section down the road. But there's your brief introduction to leasehold estates, aka non-freehold estates, estates not of ownership.
What was your example for estate for years?
An estate for years just has a very specific start date and a very specific end date. So the two examples was a 10-year commercial lease. I'm going to rent a restaurant space starting today, and it will end on the same day 10 years later. Even though it's for a long period of time, the end date is the end date is the end date. If I do not sign a new lease, get out. It will not automatically renew. The other one was a week-long beach rental. If I rent a beach house for a week, my checkout time is the end of my lease. If I'm still there after, I am a holdover tenant. I'm in a estate at sufferance. Because most vacation rentals, folks, they need you out so they can get a cleaning crew in so they can get a new set of people in later that night. That's why it's an estate for years. Don't get confused that it has to be for a long time. No, a 3-day lease could be an estate for years. What makes it an estate for years is when it's done, it's done. It will not automatically renew in any way, shape, or form ever.
So, Coach, so that's basically the difference between commercial and residential leases, that commercial leases do not automatically renew.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily just say the difference between residential and commercial because, a vacation rental is arguably, a special category. Just keep it straight as residential leases in North Carolina default to periodic tenancy. That's really the differentiation.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like a state of years, it doesn't matter how many days, months, years.
Has nothing to do with time.
Airbnbs, would that be like an estate of years?
An estate for years, it sure is. Because you check in at a certain date, you check out at a certain date, and when you're done, you're done. Get the hell out. That's all right. And like I said, this is not the only time you'll see this. Nobody panic. But that's just your brief introduction to leasehold estates. So let me give you the last couple estate mentions. Okay, we'll call these honorable mentions before we move into the next category. Well, let's talk about a marital life estate. Folks, a marital life estate is basically when you get married, you say some vows, and without a prenuptial agreement, you say what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. Or as some people like to say, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. Okay? I mean, not judging, but that's what some people say. Okay? And so a marital life estate is basically one that arises if somebody tries to disinherit their spouse. Okay? So let's say that you get... thank you, Rob. Let's say that you get married, okay, and you sign a will, and in your will, you try to leave your spouse nothing. Well, the government's going to say you can't do that because they are your spouse. You are not legally allowed to disinherit your spouse. And so they will typically use what's called a length of marriage approach. And so let's say that you have all these assets, these accounts, this real estate, and in your will, you try to leave it all to your kids and none to your spouse. They will basically say, nope, you can't do that. Based on being married for 20 years, we're going to give them 40% interest in all of those assets. And so that is what a marital life estate is. Basically, you do not have the right to disinherit your spouse. That's all it is. You can absolutely disinherit your kids. You don't have to leave them nothing, but spouses don't quite work that way. Of course, unless you have a prenuptial agreement. So that's all a marital life estate is. The homestead, folks, be careful with the word homestead, because there is a very mainstream definition of homestead going around nowadays. And I'm pretty sure it means you have chickens and you cook sourdough bread. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's all it means. If we're just being completely honest. I'm a homesteader. All right, sourdough bread it is. Got it. Okay, good for you. You have chickens. In the sense of estates, a homestead is basically a protection on property. It basically says that certain creditors cannot go after your primary residence to collect debts. Now, not all creditors. Of course, the bank who lent you money on your house absolutely can go after it. But American Express is not allowed to go after your house, is kind of the thing, because that is where you live. And so it is just a protection on your residence. That's all it is. Now, some states also have like homestead exemptions for taxes, where if it meets certain criteria, you may not have to pay full property tax rates. But for the sake of this class, a homestead is just a protected piece of real estate where creditors cannot take it if it doesn't have to do with real estate debt. That's it. Everybody still feeling okay out there? Cool.
Who determines it's a homestead?
The government. I don't know. Some areas don't even recognize it, to be honest. It really depends on the state. It depends on the legislation. It depends on the protections. It's a little more complex than just, saying it's my primary residence. Of course, in some states, you would have this protection too for being sued by somebody, right? They couldn't go after your house, but they could go after, put liens against it to make sure that you pay it, but they can't, cause you to lose it. So it would just be a jurisdictional thing. Depends. Yeah. So, in the time we have left, let's switch gears here. Understand that what we're getting into is a very similar conversation, but they're not the same thing. Okay, the reason why it's similar is because we are going to be talking about whether things can be willed or aka inherited, estates of inheritance again. But this is just dealing with the owners specifically, not necessarily the ownership, but the owners specifically and how they own it. So when we're talking about a piece of real property, can we all agree that if you want to, you can go out right now and you can buy a piece of real estate by yourself and you are the only person on the deed? That's possible. You agree?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
When you own a property by yourself, we call that ownership in severalty. Now, we already talked about the word severance, which is to sever something, and that's kind of the same thing here. Don't think of several as in many, severalty as cut off and by itself, okay? To sever. So ownership in severalty is single owner. You own a property by yourself. It's one entity owning it or one person owning it. We can all agree that ownership in severalty by yourself is clean. It's neat. If you decide to sell it, that's all it takes. If you decide to encumber it, that's all it takes. If you want to bulldoze it, that's all it takes. There is nobody else who shares in the decision making. It's just you. So it's neat. It's clean. We like this. Well, can we also agree that there are times that multiple people own the same piece of property? Meaning we have this concurrent ownership is what we call it. Spouses owning property together, that's a type of concurrent owners. Siblings owning property together, that's a type of concurrent ownership. Friends owning it together, business partners. Anytime there is more than one owner, we call it a type of concurrent ownership. Now, there are different types of concurrent ownership. But as you might imagine, folks, that can get messy. Because if we don't have agreement from all the owners to sell, what do? If we don't have agreement from all the owners to change the use, what do? And so while I'm not going to answer all these questions, of course, that's a big consideration in real estate, is because you have to understand what it legally means for you when you own property with other people. So we've got 3 different testable types of concurrent ownership: tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entirety. Now, as I did before with the freehold estates, I'm just going to walk you through each one of these individually. And then I will give you slides to reinforce it, because I feel like if you just listen to my words first, when you see the slides, it reinforces it better for you. Everybody okay with that? So let's start off with tenancy in common. Let me tell you the first really important thing about tenancy in common. Anybody can have this. You do not have to have any kind of special relationship with the other owners with you. They could be your brother, they could be your sister, they could be your best friend, they could be your business partner. Folks, they could be complete strangers. There is nothing stopping us in this room, all 39 of us, from going out and buying a property together. And we could have 39 concurrent owners as tenants in common. We would all be part owner. Nothing stopping us. We don't have to have a special relationship. Everybody okay with that? So no special relationship needed for tenancy in common. It's for anybody. Now, when we're dealing with tenancy in common, the most unique aspect of it is that each of our individual shares, folks, we would all own. I wish we had one extra in here, but normally we have 40. We're missing somebody right now. But as it is right now, 39 people, we would all own 1/39th of the property. It's just fractional, right? It's 1/39th. But even though we all each would own 1/39th of the property, it is what we would call an undivided interest. Well, that sounds contradictory, doesn't it? What do you think I mean by undivided interest in this regard?
Unequal interest.
Unequal interest?
Meaning we all have an interest in the property?
We do all have an interest in the property. Of course, we all own 1/39th.
Does it mean that all of us have to agree to own it or sell it? Like we would all have to be in.
There you go. That's a good way of looking at it. Folks, undivided means that none of us could restrict the other in any way, shape, or form. We all have to kind of just go with the flow and be on the same page. And so let me give you a real world example. Of course, 39 people is kind of hard to understand. Let me talk about the property I have in Georgia, okay? When I got that property, it was actually my grandparents' property that they owned, and I grew up going there. And when my grandmother passed away, she left that property to me, my brothers, and my cousins. There was 8 of us. And my cousins didn't really have much care about this property, but some of my brothers did. And so here's how I'm going to tell the story for the sake of understanding. I ended up buying out my cousin's share of this property. So when we inherited it, we each owned 1/8. I have 5 cousins, 2 brothers. There was 8 of us total. I purchased my 5 cousins out of it. So then I became 6/8 owner. And legally speaking, each of my brothers own 1/8 of the house I have in Georgia. And we own it as tenants in common. Now, the shares do not have to be equal. And it doesn't matter that we are or not brothers. We still just have tenants in common. So let me explain undivided in a way that helps you. Folks, I own the majority of it. But I cannot walk in there with a highlighter and tell my brothers, you can only use 1/8 of this toilet. You can only walk through 1/8 of this hallway. You can only sleep on 1/8 of this bed. That's what I mean by undivided. They are owners. They can use it just like I can use it. The reason that number matters, folks, is if we sell it, I get 6/8 of the profits. They get 1/8 each. When the tax bill comes, they are legally obligated to pay 1/8 of the tax bill. I'm obligated to pay 6/8 of it. That's why that matters. But at the end of the day, we are all owners. Let me tell you the dangers of this, folks. My brothers don't pay anything on it. Nothing. I pay for it all. I'm just a nice guy like that. But here's the thing. If one of my brothers moved into that property tomorrow, I couldn't stop them. Why? Because they're an owner. Imagine picking up the phone and calling the police. Officer, I want you to kick this part owner out of the home that they partly own. They're going to say, I'm sorry, the what? You want me to kick an owner out of the house they own? You see the complexities of this concurrent ownership. Now, folks, we can't sell it unless we all agree. And we also really can't just do what, I mean, we really can't stop each other or really do whatever we want. So there's this complexity. And let me tell you the biggest thing about tenants in common, okay? In tenancy in common, the cool thing about this ownership is, this is important, it can be willed. So in this instance, as I'm talking to you about this, we got a property. I own 6/8, and each brother owns 1/8. And so this brother has no kids, nothing. This brother has 2 kids. So this is what this means. If my brother dies that has kids, he could will his 1/8 interest to his 2 kids. And they would each now own 1/16. That's how fractions work. Because you just cut that in half. So the key point about tenancy in common is you can will your share. Now, folks, understand too, my brothers can sell their share. But imagine the sales pitch on that. Hey, you, would you like to buy a 1/8 ownership interest that's shared with my brothers on a random piece of property in the middle of nowhere in Georgia? Are any of you enticed to buy that? Probably not, but legally you can sell it. But I'm telling you, the key point of tenancy in common is it can be willed. Spoiler alert, you can't will these other 2. Everybody get pretty good feel on this tenancy in common thing that I'm talking about. Anybody can have it. Does not have to be equal shares. You can sell your share. You can will your share. We're going to get there, Michael. So that leads us to the next one, okay? Joint tenancy. Now, in joint tenancy, just like tenancy in common, this is for anybody. Friends, family members, business partners, acquaintances, doesn't matter who does this. Anybody can do this. So it's similar in that regard. However, there's a very big distinction. In joint tenancy, you cannot will your share because it has what we call a right of survivorship. And so if we had a scenario where 4 people, and I'm just going to use the alphabet here to make my life easier. Adam, Brian, Chris, and David purchased a piece of property together as joint tenants. And they all owned 25%. Oops. This critical piece called right of survivorship says that if somebody dies, their share can't be willed to somebody else. The other joint tenants absorb it. And so if Adam dies, we all turn into 33.33 repeating, because that's what 100% divided by 3 is. Owners, okay? That would be across the board. If then Brian dies, now you've got Chris and David as 50% owners. Every single time somebody dies, the surviving joint tenants absorb the share. And so understand what happens here, folks. And this, as this has gone by, Chris and David now own this as 50-50 joint tenants. And so this is said with joint tenants with right of survivorship. Now, folks, watch what happens. This is important. Let's say that Chris has a will, okay? Let's say that they all had a will. Adam had a will that said he wanted to leave his 25% to his kids. Probate would ignore that, said nothing doing, Slick. They absorb it. They would be ignored. Brian's will said the same thing. He wanted to leave his 33% to his kids. Probate says, nope, can't do it. So now you got Chris. Chris wants to leave his 50% to his kids. When Chris dies, probate's going to say, nope, can't do it, because it's still joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So now David is going to become 100% owner. Now David is an owner in severalty. If David dies, he can leave all 100% to his kids because joint tenancy is gone. That's it.
You just kill every seeking 100%.
Alex, you're getting darker and darker every second, my friend. Remind me not to go into business with you. So I'm not.
He out trying to kill somebody else.
Alex, listen, let me help you out, man.
Watch too many documentaries.
You don't need to even scheme this much, Alex. If you're ready to murder, go kill everybody in the bank and take all the money in there, dog. I don't know why you're thinking it has to go this complicated, you know? There's easier ways than scheming to like murder all the people in a joint tenancy relationship.
Nobody be a joint tenant with Alex.
Hey, there's probably a bunch of really old people with lots of money that would be really easy to take out, okay? Also, get your little old sugar mama, about 102 years old. Okay, we can help you come up with legal ways, Alex. All right, we can help you, man. So let me go back to this scenario and explain something here. When we're talking about this joint tenancy with right of survivorship, folks, please understand, I'm going to backtrack, that you can sell your share, okay? Unless stated otherwise, you are legally allowed to sell it. So now let's change something. Adam sells his 25% share. Let me tell you one of the most important things about joint tenancy. Joint tenancy has to have what we call unity of time, title, possession, and interest. There will be a slide on this, okay? Time, title, possession, and interest. What that means is we all had to take title at the same time to have joint tenancy with this right of survivorship. So if Adam sells his share to me, I cannot come in as a joint tenant, okay? They were all joint tenants across the board. I will come in as a tenant in common because I lack that unity of time, title, possession, and interest. But they will remain joint tenants. So Adam's out. These three are still joint tenants. And so as they start dying, they start absorbing the share. Brian dies. They now have what is half of 75%, right? 37, whatever it is. And then here's the interesting piece, okay? They both have half of 75% after this guy died. But you have to understand that you can't just have one joint tenant. Let me show you this. If we had 37.5, as I said, % each, they're still joint tenants. I'm on my own little island as a 25% tenant in common. If Chris dies now, David becomes a 75% owner, but he's no longer a joint tenant because the only other person left is who? Me. And I'm a tenant in common. You cannot have just one joint tenant. And so he would automatically turn into a tenant in common. So now understand, as this is all transpired, David has 75% that he can will as a tenant in common, and I have 25% that I can will as a tenant in common.
Could you will your 25% before, I don't remember, the BC and David?
Absolutely.
They all died? Okay.
As a tenant in common, if I die earlier, I could will it to somebody else. I could sell it. I could do whatever. The thing is, tenant in common ownership can be willed to your heirs and assigns. But joint tenancy with this right of survivorship, you cannot. You can sell it in your life. You could agree to record a new deed. Folks, this is all going to be outlined on the deed as well, right? It's going to say how you own this property. What you got, Alex?
So how is it assigned again? Like how the grantor is going to sign all this stuff?
Well, the grantees in this regard are going to decide it. This is not something that the grantor decided. So let me use an example. Alex, you have a property for sale, and Adam, Brian, Chris, and David decide they want to buy it together. And they decide as the grantees that they, for whatever reason, wanted to be set up as joint tenants with right of survivorship. They would decide that. The people purchasing it. Is this common? No. But once again, just because it doesn't make sense to you doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. Folks, let me tell you the main reason that joint tenancy with right of survivorship exist. It basically acts like the same type of ownership that married couples can have. But if you're not legally married but still have a significant other, you may want to buy a house as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Let me explain why. Imagine that you and your boyfriend or girlfriend, or whatever, purchase a property together as tenants in common. And let's say you got 3 kids together and your significant other passes away. Because of the way tenants in common works, their heirs and assigns may be entitled to that. So you bought this house together, you have kids together, and now your significant other passes away, their siblings may be able to go after the ownership of that property. Their mother, their father may be able to go after the ownership of that property. Their cousins may be able to go after it. Is that something that you want to deal with after a significant other passes away, fighting their family for ownership of the house y'all bought together? Even though you weren't legally married, it was still y'all's house. And so it is not uncommon for significant others who are not legally married to purchase a house as joint tenants with right of survivorship. That way, God forbid, something happens to one of you, the other is now the sole owner of the house and can keep it and maintain it for the use of your children. Does that make sense? Also, be aware, folks, there was a time when gay marriage was not legal. And so same-sex couples would very commonly do this because they couldn't have what the other legally married couples had, which is tenancy by the entirety, which is the next one on the list. I got a couple questions in the chat. Let's see, Josh says, so this breakdown only occurred because of the right of survivorship that was granted initially, not something that was granted at the sudden death of the former owner. Yeah, this was set up before people started dying. This is something you decided when you purchased this property with your co-owners, okay? Not common in any way, shape, and form. Folks, as you can imagine, would this be smart for most of us to do? No. Why would you want to invest money in something knowing that if you die first, you and your heirs lose all interest in it? But just because it doesn't make sense to you doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. I'm not sure I understand the second question, Josh. How is this still considered a joint tenancy if originally a joint tenancy is something that cannot be willed to their heirs? They purchased it in that right. They all bought this property together and said to the attorney, folks, all it takes is looking at the attorney and saying, this is how we want to own it. And so the attorney will draft up the new deed with the grantor, the person selling it, and name all 4 grantees as joint tenants with right of survivorship. And they will all be named on there. And that's all it takes. Let's go back to that example deed that I showed you earlier. Look right here. The grantees, 1/2 undivided interest and 1/2 undivided interest as tenants in common. What you got, Alex?
That ride thingy you were talking about, that basically means you're washing over somebody else's share until they have kids, and then it goes back to their share, their kids' share.
What are you talking about?
Are you talking about the rider? Was that rider what?
Hold on. Right. Where is it at? There we go. Right of survivorship is what we're talking about. Let me find the actual word here. Right of survivorship.
Oh, okay. So
and all right of survivorship is saying is that when you die, somebody else that is also a joint tenant in this relationship is going to absorb your share. Nobody's watching over it for anybody. You lose your share. So Alex, you and I buy a house together and we decide that we're going to do joint tenancy with right of survivorship. You die, your share is gone. I absorbed it, it's mine. That's what a right of survivorship is. Now, I just wanted you to see the language, but don't get it confused with what's on the screen. This is something different, so hang tight. Bo says, husband and wife buy a house together. Is it considered as tenancy in common? No. So that's the last one, folks. The last one, and I told you I've got slides for this. Tenancy by the entirety is for married couples. Okay? And tenancy by the entirety is the default. If you are legally married at the time that you buy real estate in North Carolina, it will default to tenancy by the entirety. Also, please be aware that nobody understand, nobody can do tenancy by the entirety except for married couples. Remember how in tenancy common and joint tenancy, anybody could do it. In tenancy by the entirety, only people who are legally married can do tenancy by the entirety. And so tenancy by the entirety also has that right of survivorship. Now, unlike joint tenancy, you cannot sever off your right of survivorship from tenancy by the entirety. Folks, you can't sell the share away as a spouse. You see how it's different in that regard? Of course, if we're like, four friends that own it as joint tenancy, you could sell your share. But you cannot sell your share in tenancy by the entirety because you have to be legally married to own that share. Automatic right of survivorship, okay, automatically equal shares, and you cannot knock your share away. Now, I'll provide some clarity by way of slides, but that's it in a nutshell, folks. So it's important to understand from a real estate point of view how many people own the property, who makes decisions at any point in time, how the money splits if we sell it. Is this national? Absolutely. This is all national. Now, there is one specific thing that I will tell you to differentiate one piece between state and national. Let me just skip forward for a second, folks. When we're dealing with joint tenancy, in North Carolina, the deed has to actually include the language, joint tenants with right of survivorship. It has to say those words, with right of survivorship. That is a very North Carolina specific concept. In other states, if it just says joint tenants, right of survivorship is assumed. It's automatic. North Carolina, if an attorney was to ever record a deed and it just said joint tenants, and it did not include the language with right of survivorship, it would be interpreted as basically tenants in common. We have to put that language on the deed in North Carolina that says with right of survivorship. That's the only differentiation between national and state. But these concepts are on both. So tenancy in common, as I stated, anybody can have it. Shares do not have to be equal. And of course, there is no right of survivorship in tenancy in common. You can will your share to whoever you want when you die. So I already kind of drew some pictures, but these, of course, are a little bit prettier than I can draw with my weird little mouse pen. And so if we had a property where two people bought it together, it does not have to be equal shares. So let's say that two people buy a house, decide that they're going to own it as tenants in common. We got a 60% owner, we got a 40% owner. If this 60% owner passes away, they absolutely can will their share. If they got two kids or two people they leave it to, it'll just get split. So they do each own 30% each. That is the thing about tenants in common. It can be willed. What you got, Jamila?
I just have a quick question. So my husband and my now husband and I, when we purchased our home, we wasn't married. So I would think our deed reads tenancy in common. I don't know. But now that we are married, like what happens now? Like that would supersede that, right?
That's an excellent question. So, folks, let me answer her question and let me help you understand why this is so important, okay? If you bought your house when you were not married, you are probably right. You probably purchased it as tenants in common because you would have to ask the attorney to give you right of survivorship. They're not going to do it automatically. So you probably are on the deed with your husband as now husband, not at the time, tenants in common. Folks, please understand that it does not automatically upgrade just because they are now married. They are still just owners as tenants in common. And as such, their shares could, in theory, still be willed. If they wanted to, they could draft a new deed and record a new deed that names them as owners as tenants by the entirety. But it will never happen automatically. Also, understand this other piece of complexity, folks. Let's say, just using Jamila as an example, let's say that she bought the house while she was single and then met her boyfriend who then became her husband and she got married. If she owned the property in severalty and then gets married, that will never be tenancy by the entirety either. That is what we call a marital interest. Because what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. Your husband would now have an interest in the property, but it is not tenancy by the entirety. And so North Carolina is what we call a 1 to buy, 2 to sell state. You would still need signatures of your now husband to sell it and convey clear title. But are they on their deed with you as tenants by the entirety automatically? No. Does that make sense? So whatever you had at the time it was recorded, that's what you still have. Because there is no magical upgrading in Register of Deeds land. Only what we put into the Register of Deeds exists there. So you're still tenants in common. You just happen to be married tenants in common.
Just to kind of follow up on that portion, let's say they got divorced. He still has rights to, because they like by default because of the marriage. Okay.
Hopefully your divorce attorney addresses this, because let's say that you own a property as tenancy by the entirety. If you're getting divorced, you cannot continue to own it that way. So we would need to figure out the ownership and record a new deed. But folks, let's say that you own a property. This is the scary part. This is the real world. If you own a property by yourself, and then you meet the love of your life on Tinder, and you get married, and you're like, oh my God, that was a bad idea. And 6 months later, you were separated, and then a year later, you're divorced. And you never addressed the fact that you were married and you did not have a prenuptial agreement. When you go down the road to sell that house and they see that you were married and now divorced, you got to pick up the phone and you got to call your ex, and you're going to have to say, hey, listen, I need you to sign something so I can sell this property. You know what they're going to say to you? How much is it worth to you? Because you can't convey clear title unless your ex signs away their interest. That is what we call a marital interest. And while that is not full-fledged ownership, it is a cloud on the title that could suggest that they have some interest in it. And so we typically ask them to, that's exactly right, Brenda, it happens all the time. We ask them to sign a quitclaim deed, or we ask them to sign the deed transferring it so that we remove that cloud on the title. Always a good idea to make sure you understand this before you get married if you own real estate. There you go, Alex is waiting for it. Or just kill him, you know? Or hire Alex to kill him if the price is right. Look, this is being recorded. For legal purposes, this is all a joke. What you got, Cheyenne?
So, say you and your partner purchase a house, and if you do in the deed put a right of survivorship, your children would get them, if you guys have children. And if you don't put a right of survivorship, that's a tenancy.
So it really has nothing to do with kids. That's just examples.
I'm just curious for my own personal, say we have, so just for purposes, I guess, if you put a right of survivorship, it's a joint tenancy. That right of survivorship can go to whomever, you and your partner.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship means the other person on the deed will absorb your share. So Cheyenne, you and your significant other buy a house together, and on the deed you say joint tenants with right of survivorship. You get hit by a bus tomorrow, Cheyenne, your other person on the deed now owns that property in severalty. That's what that means. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship, that's how it works. If you own the property as tenants in common, there's no right of survivorship. If you get hit by a bus, and you don't have a will, the law of intestate succession is going to kick in, and they're going to try to give your percentage of ownership not to the other owner, but to your next of kin. You don't have a spouse, so it'll be your kids. If you don't have kids, it'll be your parents. If you don't have parents, it'll be your siblings. If you don't have, you see what I'm saying? So that's the difference. It doesn't have to do with your kids per se, but joint tenancy with right of survivorship means you cannot will your share. The other joint tenant would absorb your share when you die. Tenancy in common means you can will your share. Or it can go to somebody else if you don't have a will.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. So tenancy in common is for anybody. Never has a right of survivorship. Can be willed. Joint tenancy, as I said, for anybody. Doesn't necessarily have to be equal shares, but typically is. And then I told you the big unique thing between North Carolina and national. We have to put that language that says with right of survivorship on the actual deed. That language has to be in there. Has to be. In other states, it's automatic. So folks, if you have a test question on the national side talking about joint tenancy, think right of survivorship. They're not trying to trick you. Put it in there. But if you get a test question on the North Carolina side that says what language has to be present for, right of survivorship, it would be with right of survivorship. That language has to be there. And then, as I told you, it has to have that unity of time, title, possession, and interest. One way to remember it is PIT, possession, interest, title, and time. If you watch any online learning materials, they will sometimes use the verbiage to tip, but then they never clarify that it's TTIP, and it sounds like there's an O in there, and there's not. But all this means is you cannot have joint tenancy unless you take title at the same time. That's it. So that's where I told you, if you sell your joint tenancy, that person's coming in later, so they would come in as a what?
Tenancy in common.
Tenant in common. There you go.
So if you don't want your roommate to kill you off, tenancy in common.
Yes, but if you're renting, none of this matters. But if your roommate is also your co-owner, tenants in common. Yeah. And I might suggest that you never buy a house with Alex.
Wow, you're building a reputation bad already.
That's just a suggestion. I just not a strong one. Just a suggestion.
I might win.
I'll sell my house really cheap just so they think that it's cheap and they kill them.
There you go. I know this is getting morbid real quick. Once again, all jokes. Also, Anna Grace looks scrappy. She might be able to take you, Alex. Might fall down the stairs. You don't know what happened. Folks, here's that last kind of slide talking about this unity of time, title, possession, and interest. So if you sell your share, somebody comes in later under joint tenancy, that changes the role, okay? And so now they would be a tenant in common. And so this tenant in common would not be part of the survivorship, but everybody else's would still be alive and well. As I showed you before, if you had 4 joint tenants, somebody sold, you still got 3 joint tenants that fit this mold. This other person is just on their own little island as a tenant in common. Now, as I have a tendency to do, folks, we're going to leave it there, and we will start tomorrow with tenancy by the entirety. What do you want to talk about for the last 9 minutes? Could be anything we covered today. Could be new stuff. Could be old stuff. Don't make it new stuff, but whatever you want to talk about. What you got, Jamila?
Does all of the ownership, the specifications, that goes for land too, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Land, residential, commercial, doesn't matter.
I kind of wanted to touch base over Estovers again.
Let's talk about Estovers, and then I'll get you McKinney. So Estovers, folks, I guess I kind of breezed over that, and it's just a vocabulary word. So remember when we were talking about life estates, a life tenant is an owner. That's the first thing to remember. So as such, you cannot do anything, because you're not going to own it forever. You cannot do anything that would destroy the future use of the property, right? You can't tear down the house. You can't burn it down. You can't do anything that would mess it up for the future owners, because you will not own it forever. But as an owner, you could use resources that are on the property to help pay for the property. And that's what Estovers is. Estovers is like if you cut timber to help pay for the taxes and the insurance on the property, or there was crops, or you rented it out to use the money to help pay for the property. That's all Estovers is. Use of the resources to help cover the property. You cannot do it for pure financial gain. You can do it to the benefit of the property and maintaining the property. That's all Estovers is. Good question. What you got, McKinney?
This might be silly, but going back to what we were just talking about between the tenancy by the entirety, if I'm married to somebody, could we go in and rewrite the deed or amend the deed and make it like a tenancy in common so that we have our own shares of it? Because we're kind of like forfeiting that right between the two of us to do the tenancy by entirety.
Yeah. Understand that tenancy by the entirety is the default for married couples, meaning if you're married at the time that you buy a house in North Carolina, the attorney, if you don't say anything, they're going to give you tenancy by the entirety. Automatic equal shares, automatic right of survivorship. Understand that you are not legally required to own it as tenants by the entirety. So you could go to an attorney and say, we don't want to own it that way. We want to own it as tenants in common. Now that's typically going to involve other separate legal documents, like what's called a free trader agreement, which basically says, because remember when you're married, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. A free trader agreement would allow you to get an interest in real estate that is completely separate than your spouse. And so this is very common for, in North Carolina, if you're getting a divorce, you have to be separated for a year. Well, a lot of separated couples will go ahead and buy their own real estate, but since they're legally married, if they don't sign a free trader agreement, their separated spouse would still have an interest. So it requires other documentation, but you can absolutely own it as something other than tenancy by the entirety, as long as you have an attorney drafted up, even if you're married. Excellent question. Yeah, what you got, Daniel?
That's applicable for any of these type of forms of ownership. That was basically my question for the tenancy in common.
Which part specifically? Because remember, anybody can do this. So the only unique thing is, anybody can do tenancy by the tenancy in common. Anybody can do joint tenancy. So you would just pick and choose which one you wanted. The only one that's sometimes kind of forced upon you, and the legally complicated one, because you have this legal arrangement called a marriage, is tenancy by the entirety. For the other ones, you would just pick what you wanted when you bought the property, right? So like Josh, it wouldn't make sense if we were going in and buying the property together for us to do joint tenancy with the right of survivorship. We would just say, we're going to do tenancy in common. Or we could have a business arrangement where we create an entity. There's a lot of other ways you can do things. But once again, you got to understand defaults for the test, right? Yeah. What you got, Daniel?
I was going to ask about the tenancy in common. Can they sell their share without discussing with their partner?
Yeah. Now, understand that there is legal ways to prevent that. But if it's not put in there, then sure they can. So let me put it in perspective, Daniel. Let's go back to the example with my brothers. I have it in there that my brothers cannot sell to anybody but me. It's called right of first refusal or right of first opportunity to purchase. So you can put a legal restriction that says you have to offer to sell it to me first. And if I don't buy it, then you could sell it to somebody else. So you can legally restrict it, but by default for your test, think of it as, yeah, they can sell it. Yeah, you'd have to put language in there that specifically stated they couldn't. All excellent questions, man. I like it. Y'all are a sharp group. Y'all ask the good stuff. What you got, Bo? Hope you're muted.
Sorry. Can we go back to the question? So when you are single, you buy a house, and then you get married, and then you get divorced, and then the property, because of the marriage...
Marital interest?
Is there any way to avoid that? Because you buy that property, except to kill him,
Yeah. It's called a prenuptial agreement. There you go, Vincenzo, a prenup. Folks, that is exactly what a prenup... Mike's is even better. Don't get married. A prenuptial agreement says what is going to stay solely yours that you had before your nuptials. That's what it stands for, prenuptial agreement. So before we get married, we are identifying what stays only mine and what stays only yours. So when celebrities do it all the time, right? Because, Kim Kardashian and Kanye West were both, loaded. They had a prenuptial agreement that says if they ever got divorced, she was going to keep hers, he was going to keep his. So if you don't want your spouse to potentially have an interest in your property, you've got to look them in the face and say, now, honey, darling, sweetie pie, before we get married, I need you to sign this piece of paper that says if we get divorced, it would never happen, baby girl, but if we get divorced, you ain't got nothing of my property. Sign here on the dotted line. And she's going to look at you and say, you ain't going to get nothing of this, and I'm not marrying you anymore, okay?
I see.
Yeah.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, you got it. Y'all are learning the real life lessons in here. That's not going to be on the test, okay? But, this is, but not that. Not the marriage life lesson, okay? That's the real world stuff. People don't like signing prenups. Makes them feel weird. Like, you think we're going to get divorced? Yeah. Anything else? You say something, Teray?
No.
Okay. I saw a little icon appear. So it looked like you made a noise. I was just making sure. There you go, Zach. Listen to Gold Digger. Yeah, that's it. There you go. Life lessons in that song for sure. Holla, we want prenup. We want prenup. What you got, Cheyenne?
So in a joint tenancy, maybe I missed this when you said it, but So when one dies, it gets absorbed by the others. What happens when everyone's gone? It goes to.
So in theory, if you die off sequentially, like I showed you, the last person will be 100% owner and severalty, and then they can will it off. Now, sometimes people get squirrely. I mean, they're like, Seth, what if they all died in a plane crash together? Once again, that's why attorneys make the big bucks. That's not my problem, okay? Can you imagine, like, talking to the coroner? It's like, but he died first, right? Can we just, on paper, he died first, like 2 seconds before somebody else? I don't know. But ultimately, somebody will, if everybody dies. So somebody will die, and then somebody will absorb a share. Somebody will die, somebody will absorb a share, and then somebody will be the sole owner. And at that point, when there's only one person, it's owner and severalty, they can do whatever they want. That makes sense? Folks, y'all been a blast and a half. I know that was a lot of information. Go have a drink. You have my permission, okay? Just don't drink so much that you forget what I taught you. We will do it all over again tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel. Maybe with some more Batman.